The 19th century gave the world many great novelists, but few penetrated as deeply into the contradictions of human consciousness as Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Born in Moscow on November 11th, 1821, he would become not merely a chronicler of his turbulent age, but a prophet of the psychological and spiritual crises that would define modernity itself. His works resist simple categorization as either literature or philosophy, for in Dostoevsky, these supposed opposites achieve a rare unity. Through the concrete particulars of individual human suffering, he articulated universal questions about freedom, faith, morality, and meaning that continue to resonate with extraordinary force. Dostoevsky's early years provided little hint of the revolutionary artist he would become. His father, Mikhail Andreevich, served as a doctor at the Maryinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow, a position that placed the family on the margins of the nobility while exposing young Fyodor to the suffering of Russia's underclasses. The hospital grounds where he played as a child bordered on a cemetery for criminals and suicides, those deemed unworthy of consecrated burial. This early proximity to death and social exclusion would leave permanent marks on his imagination. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, came from a merchant family and brought a gentler influence to the household. She taught her children to read using biblical stories, and Dostoevsky would later credit these early encounters with scripture as fundamental to his artistic development. The family maintained a small estate at Darovo, where Dostoevsky spent summers observing peasant life, storing impressions that would surface decades later in his mature fiction. Yet this childhood contained darkness as well. His father ruled the household with severe discipline, and after Maria's death from tuberculosis in 1837, Mikhail Andreevich's behavior grew increasingly erratic and cruel. At age 16, Dostoevsky entered the Nikolaev Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg, beginning a relationship with that strange and magnificent city that would persist throughout his life. St. Petersburg represented Russia's window to the West, a city conjured from swampland by Peter the Great's imperial will, its very existence a kind of fantastic rebellion against nature. For Dostoevsky, it would become the perfect stage for exploring the conflicts between Russian tradition and European modernity, between organic community and rational design, between the humble acceptance of limits and the proud assertion of human will. The engineering academy proved a poor fit for Dostoevsky's temperament. While competent in his studies, he spent his free hours devouring the works of Pushkin, Gogol, Schiller, Balzac, and Dickens. He began to see literature not as mere entertainment, but as a means of exploring the most fundamental questions of human existence. The sudden death of his father in 1839, reportedly murdered by his own serfs, intensified these philosophical preoccupations. Though Dostoevsky rarely spoke of this event directly, many scholars detect its influence in his later explorations of patricide, guilt, and the burden of inherited sin. Upon graduating in 1843, Dostoevsky briefly worked as an engineer before resigning his commission to pursue writing full-time. This decision required considerable courage, as it meant abandoning the security of government service for the uncertainties of literary life. His first novel, Poor Folk, appeared in 1846 to considerable acclaim. The influential critic Vissarion Belinsky declared that a new Gogol had appeared, and overnight Dostoevsky found himself celebrated in St. Petersburg, Petersburg's literary circles. The novel's epistolary form allowed him to explore the inner lives of society's marginalized members, revealing unexpected depths of feeling and moral sensitivity in characters typically dismissed as insignificant. Yet this early success proved fleeting. His second novel, The Double, received a cooler reception, its psychological complexity and formal innovations puzzling readers expecting another exercise in social realism. The story of a petty clerk who encounters his exact duplicate explored themes of divided consciousness and social alienation that would become central to Dostoevsky's mature work, but in 1846 these preoccupations seemed merely eccentric, and Dostoevsky found himself increasingly isolated from the literary establishment he had so recently conquered. During this period, he began attending meetings of the Petroshevsky Circle, a group of young intellectuals who gathered to discuss French utopian socialism, particularly the ideas of Charles Fourier. The Circle represented one of many such groups emerging across Europe in the 1840s, animated by dreams of social transformation through rational planning and communal organization. For Dostoevsky, these meetings offered intellectual stimulation and comradeship, though he remained skeptical of the more radical proposals for revolutionary action. He was drawn more to the group's discussions of literature and philosophy than to its political schemes. This distinction would prove irrelevant to the Tsarist authorities. In the wake of the European revolutions of 1848, Nicholas I moved to crush any hint of subversion within Russia. On April 23, 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested, along with other members of the Petroshevsky Circle. For 8 months, he languished in the Peter and Paul fortress, subjected to intensive interrogation about his political activities and beliefs. The authorities seemed particularly concerned about a letter he had read aloud at one meeting, written by Belinsky to Gogol, which criticized the Orthodox Church and defended Western liberal values. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion. On November 16, 1849, Dostoevsky and 14 other defendants were sentenced to death by firing squad. For 3 weeks they lived with this knowledge, preparing themselves for execution. Then, on December 22nd, they were led to Semyonovsky Square, where scaffolds had been erected and soldiers waited with loaded rifles. The first group of prisoners, including Dostoevsky, was tied to the posts. The command was given to take aim. At that moment, with rifle barrels pointed at his chest, Dostoevsky experienced what he later described as a revelation of life's infinite value, each remaining second expanding to contain whole universes of meaning. Then, at the last possible instant, a courier arrived with news that the Tsar had commuted their sentences. The entire execution had been a carefully orchestrated piece of psychological torture, designed to break the prisoner's spirits while demonstrating the sovereign's absolute power over life and death. One prisoner, Nikolai Grigoriev, lost his sanity on the spot, never to recover. Dostoevsky himself would carry the trauma of this experience for the rest of his life, returning to it obsessively in his fiction as a means of exploring the boundaries of human endurance and the mysteries of providence. His actual sentence proved harsh enough: 4 years of hard labour in a Siberian prison camp, followed by an indefinite term of military service. On Christmas Eve, 1849, he began the long journey eastward, travelling in chains through the Russian winter. The journey itself lasted weeks, a prolonged transition from his former life as a Petersburg intellectual to his new existence as a convict. Along the way, in the town of Tobolsk, he received a visit from the wives of the Decembrists, aristocratic women who had followed their husbands into Siberian exile decades earlier. They gave him a copy of the New Testament, the only book permitted in the prison camp, which he would read and reread until its pages nearly disintegrated. The prison camp at Omsk represented a complete inversion of everything Dostoevsky had known. Here, aristocratic political prisoners mixed with common criminals, murderers, and thieves. The work was backbreaking, the conditions brutal, the punishments savage. Yet Dostoevsky would later describe this period as crucial to his development as both artist and thinker. Stripped of his class privileges and intellectual pretensions, he encountered the Russian people in their rawest form. He discovered that many of his fellow prisoners, despite their crimes, possessed a moral depth and spiritual intensity that exceeded anything he had encountered in Petersburg salons. This experience fundamentally altered his understanding of human nature. The Enlightenment view of man as essentially rational, capable of organizing society according to scientific principles, could not account for what he witnessed in Omsk. The prisoners were capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often within the same hour. They could endure unimaginable suffering while maintaining an inner freedom that no chains could bind. They believed in God and committed terrible sins, sometimes simultaneously. They defied every attempt at systematic explanation. One incident particularly struck him. On Easter Sunday, the prisoners were allowed to attend church, and Dostoevsky watched as these hardened criminals wept during the service, prostrating themselves before the icon of Christ. He realized that their faith operated according to a logic entirely different from the rational religion of educated society. It was immediate, visceral, rooted not in theological arguments, but in a direct encounter with suffering and redemption. This popular Christianity, with its emphasis on humility, communal solidarity, and mystical experience, would become central to his mature religious vision. The physical conditions of prison life left permanent marks on his body. He developed epilepsy during this period, possibly triggered by the extreme stress and deprivation. These seizures would plague him for the rest of his life, yet he would also describe them as moments of mystical insight, brief glimpses of a higher harmony normally hidden from human consciousness. The disease became another form of doubleness, simultaneously a curse and a strange blessing, a source of suffering and of vision. After completing his prison term in 1854, Dostoevsky served as a private in the Siberian regiment stationed in Semipalatinsk. Here he slowly rebuilt his life, beginning to write again despite official prohibitions. He married Maria Dmitrievna Isayeva, a widow with a young son, though the marriage would prove troubled from the start. He also formed a crucial friendship with Baron Alexander Wrangel, who would help him petition for permission to return to European Russia. Through Wrangel, he gained access to books and journals, reconnecting with intellectual life after years of isolation. The death of Nicholas I in 1855 and the accession of Alexander II brought a general liberalization of Russian society. Dostoevsky received permission to publish again, and in 1859 he was finally allowed to return to St. Petersburg. He arrived to find a transformed literary landscape. A new generation of radical critics, led by Nikolai Chernyshevsky and Nikolai Dobrol-Lyubov, dominated the influential journals. They promoted a utilitarian aesthetic that judged art solely by its social utility, dismissing psychological complexity and spiritual questions as bourgeois self-indulgence. Dostoevsky found himself at odds with this new orthodoxy. His Siberian experiences had convinced him that human nature was far more complex than any social theory could encompass. The attempt to reorganize society according to rational principles, however noble its intentions, ignored the irrational depths of the human heart. Yet he also rejected the conservative position that defended tradition for its own sake. He sought a third path, one that acknowledged both the necessity of social transformation and the irreducible mystery of human consciousness. With his brother Mikhail, he founded the journal Vremya, meaning time, which promoted a philosophy of pochvenichestvo, usually translated as native soil conservatism, though this translation fails to capture its full complexity. The movement sought to bridge the gap between Russia's westernized intelligentsia and its traditional peasant culture, arguing that genuine progress required organic development from national roots rather than imported foreign models. The journal published works by diverse authors, including radical critics, though always within a framework that emphasized Russian particularity. The venture initially proved successful, attracting subscribers with its combination of literary quality and political moderation. Dostoevsky serialized his novel The Insulted and Injured, which explored themes of suffering and redemption while experimenting with narrative techniques that would reach full flower in his later works. He also published his account of prison life, Notes from the House of the Dead, presented as the fictional memoir of a nobleman convicted of murdering his wife. The work offered Russian readers their first detailed glimpse into the world of Siberian imprisonment, combining documentary observation with philosophical reflection. Yet this period of relative stability proved brief. In 1863, the government shut down Vremya after misinterpreting an article about the Polish uprising as unpatriotic. The financial loss was devastating, compounded by the death of both his wife Maria and his brother Mikhail in 1864. Dostoevsky found himself responsible for his brother's family as well as his own stepson, burdened with debts that would haunt him for years. He launched a new journal, Epoka, but it failed to achieve the success of its predecessor and folded within a year. These personal and professional catastrophes coincided with a broader crisis in Russian society. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had raised enormous hopes for national renewal, but the actual implementation proved disappointing, leaving peasants legally free but economically enslaved. The younger generation, frustrated by the slow pace of reform, turned increasingly to radical solutions. Some embraced nihilism, rejecting all traditional values in favor of a purely materialist worldview. Others joined revolutionary conspiracies, convinced that only violence could destroy the old order and create space for the new. Dostoevsky watched these developments with deep concern. He sympathized with the young radicals' desire for justice, but feared that their methods would lead only to greater suffering. Their faith in reason and science struck him as dangerously naive, ignoring the dark forces within human nature that no social engineering could eliminate. Yet he also recognized that traditional Christianity, at least in its official forms, had failed to address the legitimate grievances driving revolutionary fervor. A new synthesis was needed, one that could speak to modern consciousness while preserving eternal truths. This quest would drive his greatest creative period. Between 1864 and 1881, he would produce a series of novels that transformed not only Russian literature, but world culture. Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. Each work represented a laboratory for exploring different aspects of the modern crisis, testing ideas through the concrete experiences of unforgettable characters. He developed a method he called Polyphony, allowing multiple voices and perspectives to coexist without resolution into a single authoritative viewpoint. This technique reflected his conviction that truth emerged not from abstract reasoning, but from the living dialogue between different forms of consciousness. The Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, writing in the 1920s and early 1960s, identified what he considered the defining feature of Dostoevsky's fiction: polyphony. In traditional novels, Bakhtin argued, the author's voice dominates. The narrator controls the meaning of events, judges the characters, and presents a unified worldview. Characters exist as objects of the author's consciousness, illustrations of the author's ideas. This is what Bakhtin called the monologic novel. Dostoevsky, by contrast, created the polyphonic novel, a form in which multiple independent consciousnesses coexist without being subordinated to a single authorial perspective. Each major character in Dostoevsky's novels possesses a full and autonomous inner life. Each has his or her own ideological position, his or her own way of seeing the world. And these positions are not resolved into a single truth. Instead, they remain in dialogue, in conflict, in tension. The meaning of the novel emerges not from the author's judgment, but from the interaction among these voices. This is not simply a matter of literary technique. It reflects Dostoevsky's deepest philosophical conviction that truth is dialogical, not monological. Truth cannot be possessed by a single consciousness in isolation. It arises in the encounter between consciousnesses, in the space of dialogue and relation. To silence another voice, to reduce another person to an object of one's own understanding, is to violate the very structure of truth and personhood. Bakhtin saw this as Dostoevsky's great discovery, and he argued that it represented a revolution in the novel comparable to the shift from medieval to modern science. Whether or not one accepts Bakhtin's grand claims, his analysis illuminates something essential about Dostoevsky's method. Reading a Dostoevsky novel is unlike reading Tolstoy or Turgenev or even Dickens. The reader is not guided by a benevolent narrator who explains what to think and feel. Instead, the reader is thrust into a cacophony of conflicting perspectives, each presented with such intensity and conviction that it becomes difficult to know where the author stands. Is Dostoevsky on the side of Ivan Karamazov or Alyosha? Does he endorse the underground man's rebellion or condemn it? The answer is that he does not resolve these questions. He stages them, dramatizes them, and leaves the reader to wrestle with them. This method has profound ethical implications. By refusing to reduce his characters to objects, by granting them autonomy and voice, Dostoevsky enacts in his fiction the respect for personhood that he insists is the foundation of ethics. He does not tell us what Raskolnikov is. He allows Raskolnikov to speak, to think, to change, to surprise us. And in doing so, he reminds us that no person is exhausted by any description, any category, any judgment. Every person is a living center of consciousness, a subject, not an object. This is what Dostoevsky means by freedom. It is not simply the ability to choose between options. It is the irreducibility of the person, the fact that no system, no theory, no ideology can fully capture or control the human subject, and it is this freedom that makes genuine dialogue possible. Dialogue, in Dostoevsky's sense, is not a polite exchange of opinions. It is a confrontation, a struggle, a risk. To enter into dialogue with another is to expose oneself to the possibility of being changed, challenged, even shattered by what the other says. It is to acknowledge that the other's perspective has a claim on truth that one's own perspective does not exhaust. Bakhtin also introduced the concept of carnival to describe the atmosphere of Dostoevsky's novels. Carnival, in Bakhtin's usage, refers to a medieval and Renaissance tradition of festive celebration in which social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, the sacred was profaned, and the body's material existence was affirmed in opposition to official culture's solemnity and idealism. In the carnival, kings became fools, and fools became kings. High and low, sacred and profane, were turned inside out. Bakhtin argued that Dostoevsky's novels adopt a carnivalesque structure. They bring together characters from all levels of society, intellectuals and prostitutes, monks and murderers, aristocrats and clerks, and place them in situations of scandal, humiliation, and grotesque exposure. The scandals in Dostoevsky's novels are not accidents. They are central to his method. In scenes of scandal, the masks come off. Characters reveal themselves in ways they did not intend. The polite surface of social life cracks open, and the raw, contradictory, uncontrollable energies of human existence pour out. These scenes are often painful to read. They violate decorum and good taste, but they are also moments of truth. Consider the scandal scenes in The Brothers Karamazov, Fyodor Pavlovich's grotesque performance at the monastery, Dmitri's humiliation at the gathering, Ivan's feverish confrontation with the devil, or the scandal in The Idiot when Nastasia Filipovna throws money into the fire and denounces herself in front of the assembled guests. Or the climactic scene in Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov confesses his crime in a moment of public exposure. In each case, the scandal strips away pretense and forces the characters to confront themselves and each other without mediation. It is in these moments that Dostoevsky's dialogism is most intense. The carnival, Bakhtin argued, is the literary equivalent of the town square, the public space where all voices meet and clash. It resists the privatization of consciousness, the retreat into solitary interiority. It insists that the self is formed in relation to others, through address and response, through the gaze of the other and the word of the other. This is why Dostoevsky's characters talk so much. They are compelled to speak, to confess, to justify themselves, to accuse and be accused. They cannot remain silent because silence would mean the death of the self. The dialogical self is not a stable, unified entity. It is divided, contradictory, multiple. The underground man says one thing and means another. Raskolnikov vacillates between pride and self-loathing. Ivan Karamazov argues passionately for positions he does not entirely believe. This is not a failure of characterization. It is an accurate representation of how consciousness actually works. We are not transparent to ourselves. We do not possess a single, coherent identity. We are sites of conflict, arenas in which different voices contend. Dostoevsky understood this long before Freud formulated the theory of the unconscious, and he understood that this internal division is not pathological, but constitutive of personhood. To be a person is to be a question, not an answer. It is to be unfinished, open, capable of change. Any attempt to fix the self, to reduce it to a formula or a type, is a kind of death. This is what makes Dostoevsky's novels so unsettling. They offer no stable ground, no final resolution, no comforting certainty. They present us with the vertigo of freedom, the terror and exhilaration of being unfinished. Bakhtin's concept of polyphony helps us understand why Dostoevsky's novels continue to feel so alive, so urgent, so resistant to interpretation. They are not puzzles to be solved or messages to be decoded. They are ongoing conversations to which we are invited as participants. Each reading brings new voices into the dialogue, new perspectives, new questions. The novels change as we change, reflecting back to us our own evolving understanding of freedom, responsibility, and the human condition. This is the gift of Dostoevsky's dialogical art. It does not impose a single truth, but creates a space in which truth can emerge through encounter, through struggle, through the risky and transformative work of genuine dialogue. And it reminds us that we too are dialogical beings, that our own consciousness is formed and reformed through our encounters with others, and that the search for truth is never a solitary endeavour, but always a shared journey. Notes from Underground is Dostoevsky's most concentrated and philosophical work. It is short, intense, and deliberately unpleasant. The narrator, known only as the Underground Man, is a retired civil servant who lives alone in a shabby corner of St. Petersburg. He is sick, spiteful, and bitter. He addresses the reader directly, sometimes aggressively, sometimes defensively, and delivers a long, rambling confession that is part philosophical argument and part psychological self-laceration. The novella is divided into two parts. The first part, titled Underground, is a monologue in which the underground man lays out his critique of rational egoism and his defense of irrational freedom. The second part, titled Apropos of the Wet Snow, recounts episodes from his past, particularly his humiliating interactions with former schoolmates and a young prostitute named Liza. The two parts complement each other. The first establishes the underground man's ideas. The second reveals the psychological and moral consequences of those ideas. The underground man begins by declaring that he is a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. He refuses to see a doctor even though he believes his liver is diseased. Why should he seek treatment when refusing treatment allows him to spite himself and assert his perverse independence? This refusal sets the tone for everything that follows. The underground man is defined by negation. He rejects the values and assumptions of his society, but he has nothing to put in their place. He is trapped in a posture of defiance that turns inward and consumes him. His primary target is the ideology of rational egoism, which was fashionable among Russian radicals in the 1860s. Rational egoism held that human beings act in their own self-interest, and that if properly educated, they would recognize that their true interest lies in cooperating with others for the common good. Reason, it was believed, could calculate the path to happiness and well-being. If people understood the laws of nature and society, they would naturally choose the right course of action. This was the view espoused by Nikolai Chernyshevsky in his novel What Is to Be Done, published in 1863, which became influential among the radical intelligentsia. The underground man rejects this optimism entirely. He argues that reason cannot dictate human behavior because human beings do not act solely in their rational self-interest. They act on impulse, passion, whim, and most importantly on the desire to assert their own will. People do things that harm them, that make them miserable, simply to prove that they are free, that they are not machines, that they cannot be predicted or controlled. The underground man offers the example of a man who might act against his advantage just to spite the rational egoists, just to demonstrate that arithmetic does not govern human affairs. He insists on the right to desire, the right to choose irrationally, the right to suffer if one wishes. To deny this right is to deny what is most human about us. It is to reduce persons to keys on a piano, to organ stops that can be played by whoever knows the rules. And the underground man refuses to be reduced. He would rather be mad, rather be wretched, rather be wrong than surrender his freedom. This is not a defense of irrationality for its own sake. It is a defense of personhood against the claims of any system that pretends to know in advance what a person is or should be. The underground man is not arguing that we should act irrationally all the time. He is arguing that the capacity to act irrationally is essential to being human, and that any theory which excludes that capacity is false and dangerous. He points out that the rational egoists imagine a future in which all human needs are satisfied and all conflicts resolved. This vision is symbolized by the Crystal Palace, the great glass exhibition hall built in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Crystal Palace was a monument to progress, science, and rational order. For Chernyshevsky and his followers, it represented the future of humanity, a harmonious, transparent society built on scientific principles. For the underground man, it represents a nightmare. In the Crystal Palace, there would be nothing left to desire, nothing to strive for, no possibility of revolt. Life would be comfortable, predictable, and utterly meaningless. The underground man asks, what would people do in such a world? They would smash it. They would destroy it out of sheer boredom, out of the need to prove that they are still alive, still free, still capable of negation. This is a profound insight into the limits of every form of rationalized social planning. The underground man understands that human beings are not merely creatures of need and desire who seek satisfaction. They are creatures of will who seek significance. And significance requires the possibility of choice, including the choice to refuse, to destroy, to say no. A world without that possibility would not be paradise. It would be a prison. The underground man's rebellion is thus directed not only against the specific doctrines of the Russian radicals, but against the entire modern project of rationalizing and systematizing human life. He sees this project at work in the writings of Mill and Bentham, in the socialist schemes of Fourier, in the scientific materialism that was gaining influence across Europe. All of these thinkers, despite their differences, share the assumption that human behavior can be understood and regulated through reason, that the good society is one in which scientific knowledge guides collective action, and that freedom consists in the rational pursuit of happiness. The underground man denies all of this. He insists that freedom is the capacity to act against reason, against happiness, against one's own advantage, and he claims that this capacity is what makes us human. But the underground man is not a hero. Dostoevsky does not endorse his position without irony. The second part of Notes from Underground reveals the underground man's cruelty, pettiness, and self-loathing. He torments Liza, a young prostitute he encounters, by alternately offering her hope and crushing her with contempt. He does this not because he hates her, but because he hates himself and cannot bear the vulnerability that genuine connection would require. He is trapped in his underground, paralyzed by self-consciousness, incapable of action or love. His rebellion against reason has not liberated him. It has isolated him. He is free in the negative sense, free from external authority, free from social obligation, but he is not free in any positive sense. He cannot create, cannot love, cannot even act consistently on his own principles. This is the tragedy of the underground man. His critique of rational egoism is devastating, but his alternative is solipsism and despair. He has identified the problem, but he has no solution. And Dostoevsky leaves him there, underground, talking endlessly to himself, unable to escape the prison of his own consciousness. The underground man represents a crucial stage in Dostoevsky's exploration of freedom. He shows us what happens when freedom is understood purely negatively, as the refusal of all external determination. Such freedom does not lead to fulfillment or flourishing. It leads to paralysis, resentment, and self-destruction. The underground man has won his independence from the tyranny of rational systems, but he has nothing to replace them with. He has no commitments, no loves, no projects that would give his freedom content and direction. And so his freedom becomes a burden, a source of torment rather than liberation. This is the question that will drive Dostoevsky's subsequent novels. How can we affirm freedom without falling into nihilism? How can we avoid the reduction of persons to things without abandoning moral responsibility? How can we honor the irreducibility of each individual while still recognizing our solidarity and interdependence? The underground man poses these questions with brutal clarity, but he cannot answer them. That work will fall to other characters, other voices in the great novels to come. To understand what the underground man is arguing against, we must examine the doctrines of rational egoism more closely. The term rational egoism is somewhat misleading. It does not mean selfish egoism in the ordinary sense. Rather, it refers to the belief that rational self-interest, properly understood, will lead individuals to act morally and cooperatively. The idea is that if people understand their true interests, they will see that those interests are best served by promoting the common good. Lying, stealing, and violence may bring short-term gains, but in the long run, they undermine the social conditions necessary for individual flourishing. Therefore, enlightened self-interest will naturally align with virtue. This is the doctrine advanced by Chernyshevsky in What Is to Be Done, and echoed by many progressive intellectuals of the time. It was part of a broader utilitarian framework derived from English thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who argued that the goal of ethics and politics is to maximize happiness or utility for the greatest number of people. Rational egoism is attractive because it promises to ground morality in reason rather than in tradition, religion, or arbitrary authority. It suggests that we do not need divine commandments or metaphysical principles to behave well. We need only to think clearly about our interests and act accordingly. And if everyone were educated to think rationally, social problems would solve themselves. Poverty, crime, and injustice would disappear because people would recognize that cooperation produces better outcomes than conflict. This vision animated much of the progressive politics of the 19th century. It fueled campaigns for education, for the abolition of serfdom, for legal reform, for scientific rationalization of society, and it inspired utopian experiments, from Fourier's phalansteries to various communal living arrangements in which rational organization was supposed to create a new human being freed from superstition and selfishness. The Crystal Palace became a symbol of this rational utopia. The building itself was a triumph of engineering, an enormous structure of glass and iron that enclosed exhibition space of unprecedented scale. It was transparent, luminous, and seemed to embody the modern age's confidence that science and reason could reshape the world, that nothing was fixed or sacred, that everything could be analyzed, improved, and reconstructed according to rational principles. Chernyshevsky invoked the Crystal Palace explicitly in What Is to Be Done as the image of the socialist future. In his novel, the heroine dreams of a vast, radiant palace where humanity lives in harmony and abundance, free from exploitation and suffering. The dream is seductive. Who would not want a world without poverty, without cruelty, without meaningless suffering? The underground man understands the seduction, but he also sees the danger. He sees that the Crystal Palace is not simply a building or a social arrangement. It is a metaphor for a certain way of thinking about human life, a way that reduces persons to units in a calculation, that treats freedom as the absence of obstacles rather than as the capacity for self-determination, and that assumes that happiness is the only legitimate human goal. The underground man rejects all of this. He insists that human beings want more than happiness. They want significance. They want to assert themselves, to leave a mark, to be recognized as subjects rather than objects, and they will sacrifice happiness to achieve this. The underground man's famous declaration about arithmetic is not a denial of mathematical truth. It is a refusal to accept that mathematics exhausts reality, that everything real can be quantified and calculated. The statement is paradoxical and deliberately provocative. It is meant to shock the rational egoists into recognizing the limits of their system. Dostoevsky himself was deeply troubled by the vision of the Crystal Palace. During his first trip to Europe in 1862, he visited London and saw both the industrial achievements and the terrible squalor of the slums. He wrote in his travel notes, winter notes on summer impressions, that the Crystal Palace made him feel a kind of dread. It was, he said, something so complete and perfect that it left no room for dissent or doubt. And precisely because it was so complete, it felt like a trap, like the end of human striving. Dostoevsky connected this to biblical imagery, to the Tower of Babel, and to Babylon, the great city that represents human pride and the refusal of God. The Crystal Palace, he suggested, was a modern Babylon, a testament to the belief that humanity could create paradise through its own efforts, without reference to anything beyond itself. And like Babylon, it was doomed to fall, not because of external enemies, but because of its internal contradictions, because it violated something essential in human nature. This is the core of Dostoevsky's critique of modernity. He believed that the modern age, in its pursuit of rationality, efficiency, and material progress, had forgotten or denied the depth and complexity of the human soul. It had reduced persons to consumers, producers, or citizens, to economic or political units defined by their function in a system. It had lost sight of the fact that every person is a mystery, an infinite depth, a being made in the image of God and therefore possessing an irreducible dignity that no system can capture or control. The rational egoists meant well. They wanted to alleviate suffering, to create justice, to improve the human condition. Dostoevsky did not doubt their sincerity, but he believed that their methods would lead to tyranny, because any system that claims to know in advance what is best for people will eventually impose that knowledge by force. And he believed that their vision was impoverished, because it excluded the most important dimensions of human existence: freedom, suffering, love, and the possibility of redemption. The Crystal Palace stands as a warning. It represents the dream of a perfectly rationalized society, a world without conflict or suffering, a world in which all human needs are met through scientific planning and social engineering. But Dostoevsky insists that such a world would be inhuman. It would eliminate not only suffering, but also freedom, not only conflict, but also meaning, not only struggle, but also the possibility of genuine love and authentic choice. The attempt to create paradise on earth, to solve the problem of human existence through reason alone, will always fail. And it will fail not because the planners are wicked, but because they have misunderstood what human beings are. We are not problems to be solved. We are mysteries to be encountered, persons to be loved, subjects to be honoured in all our irreducible complexity and freedom. The underground man's insistence on the right to desire is one of the most provocative and misunderstood elements of Notes from Underground. What does it mean to claim a right to desire, and why is this right so important? The answer lies in Dostoevsky's understanding of freedom. For the rational egoists, freedom means the absence of external constraint. A person is free when he or she can pursue his or her interests without interference from others. This is negative freedom, freedom from, and it is indeed an important value. But Dostoevsky argues that this is not enough. Genuine freedom requires the capacity for self-determination, the ability to choose not merely among existing options, but to create new possibilities, to act in ways that cannot be predicted or explained by any law or system. This is positive freedom, freedom too, and it is inseparable from the capacity to desire, to will, to affirm oneself as a subject. Desire in this context does not mean mere appetite or inclination. It means the fundamental orientation of the will towards something beyond itself, the intentionality of consciousness, the fact that we are always already engaged with the world and with others. To desire is to reach out, to project oneself into the future, to stake a claim on meaning. And the content of desire is not fixed in advance. We do not simply have desires that we then seek to satisfy. We create our desires through the process of living, through our encounters with others, through the choices we make. This is why Dostoevsky insists that we cannot be reduced to a set of preferences that could be known and manipulated by an external observer. Our desires are not data. They are expressions of our freedom, and they change as we change. The rational egoists believed that if we understood the laws of human nature, we could predict and guide human behavior. Dostoevsky denies that there are such laws, at least not in the deterministic sense that the rational egoists imagined. Human beings are not natural objects like stones or plants. They are subjects, centers of consciousness and will, and their behavior is shaped by their interpretations, their projects, their choices. This does not mean that human behavior is random or arbitrary. It means that it is meaningful, that it is oriented toward ends that the person herself defines, and that it cannot be understood without reference to those ends. The underground man's rebellion against arithmetic is an expression of this insight. When he speaks of resisting mathematical certainty, he is not denying the validity of mathematics. He is denying that human life can be reduced to mathematical calculation. The rational egoists believed that ethics could be based on a calculus of pleasure and pain, that we could add up the quantities of happiness produced by different actions and choose the one that maximized utility. This approach is exemplified in utilitarian thought. Dostoevsky saw such calculations as absurd and dangerous. They are absurd because they ignore the qualitative differences among experiences, the fact that not all pleasures are commensurable, and the reality that people value things other than pleasure, such as dignity, honor, freedom, and meaning. They are dangerous because they provide a rationale for sacrificing individuals to the collective, for treating persons as means rather than ends, for overriding conscience and personal conviction in the name of the greater good. If ethics is just arithmetic, then the individual counts for nothing. He or she is simply one unit in a sum, and if eliminating that unit increases the total, then elimination is justified. Dostoevsky returns to this theme again and again. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov justifies his murder of the pawnbroker by arguing that her death will produce a net gain in well-being. She is useless, exploitative. If he kills her and uses her money to help others, the sum of human welfare will increase. The calculation seems rational, but Dostoevsky shows that it is monstrous. The pawnbroker is not a mere quantity in a sum, she is a person, and no calculation can justify taking her life. Raskolnikov's crime is not a failure of arithmetic, it is a failure of recognition, a failure to see the pawnbroker as an irreducible subject rather than an object to be weighed and discarded. And the underground man anticipates this. He argues that any attempt to reduce persons to quantities, to treat human life as a problem to be solved by calculation, will result in violence and dehumanization. The right to desire is the right to resist this reduction, to insist that one is more than a sum, more than a number, more than a function in a system. It is the right to say, I am, and that means something that no theory can exhaust. But there is a dark side to this insistence on freedom. The underground man's exercise of his right to desire does not lead to fulfillment or flourishing. It leads to spite, paralysis, and suffering. He desires, but he does not know what he desires. He asserts his will, but he has no direction, no purpose, no love. His freedom becomes a burden, a source of torment rather than liberation. And this is precisely Dostoevsky's point. Freedom alone is not enough. Without some orientation toward the good, without some commitment to others, without some recognition of values beyond the self, freedom collapses into nihilism. The underground man has escaped the tyranny of rational egoism, but he has nothing to replace it with. He has won his independence, but at the cost of his humanity. This is the tragedy of the underground. Freedom without meaning, rebellion without affirmation, negation without creation. And it is the problem that Dostoevsky will explore in all his subsequent novels. How can we affirm freedom without falling into nihilism? How can we avoid the reduction of persons to things without abandoning moral responsibility? How can we honor the irreducibility of each individual while still recognizing our solidarity and interdependence? These are not abstract questions. They are existential questions, questions that determine how we live and who we become. The right to desire is ultimately the right to be a person, to be recognized as a subject rather than an object, to have one's freedom acknowledged and honored. But that right carries with it a terrible responsibility. If we are free, if we can desire and choose, then we are also responsible for what we desire and what we choose. We cannot escape into determinism, cannot hide behind the claim that we had no choice, cannot blame our circumstances or our nature. We must own our choices, accept their consequences, and live with the knowledge of what we have done. This is the burden of freedom, and it is a burden that Dostoevsky's characters struggle with throughout his novels. The underground man glimpses this burden but cannot bear it. He remains trapped in his underground, asserting his freedom through negation, but unable to take the next step, unable to move from rebellion to affirmation, from isolation to connection, from death to life. Crime and Punishment appeared serially in the journal The Russian Messenger in 1866, just 2 years after Notes from Underground. It is Dostoevsky's first full-length novel after his return from Siberia, and it remains one of his most widely read and discussed works. The novel tells the story of Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, a young former law student living in desperate poverty in St. Petersburg. Raskolnikov conceives a plan to murder Alyona Ivanovna, an elderly pawnbroker, and to steal her money. He convinces himself that the murder is justified on multiple grounds. First, the pawnbroker is a vicious and parasitic woman who preys on the poor and serves no useful purpose. Second, the money he takes from her will enable him to complete his education, support his family, and do good in the world. Third, and most importantly, the murder will test his theory that extraordinary individuals have the right to transgress moral law for the sake of a higher purpose. Raskolnikov believes himself to be such an extraordinary individual, a figure who stands above ordinary morality and can remake the world according to his will. The murder itself occurs early in the novel. Raskolnikov enters the pawnbroker's apartment under the pretense of pawning an item, then strikes her on the head with an axe. The act is brutal, clumsy, and terrifying. Worse, Alyona's half-sister Lizaveta unexpectedly returns to the apartment, and Raskolnikov is forced to kill her as well. Lizaveta is innocent, gentle, and harmless. Her murder is entirely unplanned and serves no purpose in Raskolnikov's scheme. From this moment, the novel shifts from a crime story to a psychological and spiritual drama. Raskolnikov's theory collapses almost immediately. He is overwhelmed by horror, guilt, and fear. He becomes ill, feverish, paranoid. He cannot enjoy or even touch the money he has stolen. He hides it under a rock and forgets about it. He is haunted not only by the fear of being caught, but by the unbearable weight of what he has done. And he is haunted by the question that torments him throughout the novel. Am I an extraordinary person, someone who can transgress with impunity? Or am I an ordinary person, someone who cannot bear the burden of transgression? The novel follows Raskolnikov's psychological disintegration over the course of several days. He is pursued by Porfiry Petrovich, an astute police investigator who suspects him but lacks evidence. Porfiry plays a careful game with Raskolnikov, probing his psychological state, waiting for him to confess. But the real drama is internal. Raskolnikov is divided against himself. Part of him clings to his theory, insists that he was right to kill the pawnbroker, that his only mistake was weakness and fear. Another part of him is crushed by guilt, longs for punishment, and yearns for some kind of redemption. He is attracted to Sonya Marmeladova, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her destitute family. Sonya is the moral center of the novel. She is pure, compassionate, and deeply religious. She suffers terribly, but does not despair. She believes in God and in the possibility of forgiveness. Raskolnikov confesses his crime to her, and she urges him to confess publicly, to accept his suffering, and to seek atonement. The novel culminates in Raskolnikov's confession to the police and his sentencing to 8 years of penal servitude in Siberia. Sonya follows him into exile. In the epilogue, set some time later, Raskolnikov experiences a kind of spiritual awakening. He does not yet understand it or articulate it fully, but he feels a stirring of love for Sonya and a sense that a new life is beginning. Crime and Punishment is often read as a moral tale about guilt and redemption, and it is certainly that. But it is also a philosophical novel, an exploration of the logic of transgression and the limits of rationalism. Raskolnikov's theory is a direct descendant of the rational egoism critiqued in Notes from Underground. He believes that morality is conventional, that it is imposed by society to control the weak, and that exceptional individuals can see through this fiction and act according to their own will. He believes that murder can be justified by consequences, that if the net result is positive, the act is permissible. This is utilitarian logic taken to its extreme, and Dostoevsky shows that it leads not to liberation, but to catastrophe. Raskolnikov discovers that he is not exceptional in the way he imagined. He cannot simply will himself beyond morality. He is a human being with a conscience, and conscience is not a social construct that can be discarded by an act of will. It is something deeper, something constitutive of personhood. When Raskolnikov murders the pawnbroker, he does not overcome morality. He violates his own humanity, and the result is not freedom but agony. This is the central insight of crime and punishment. The moral law is not external to us. It is woven into the fabric of our being. To transgress it is to wound oneself, to tear oneself apart. Raskolnikov's suffering is not simply the fear of punishment, it is the existential horror of having betrayed his own nature. He has tried to become something he is not, and the attempt has destroyed him. The novel thus refutes the idea that morality is arbitrary or conventional. Dostoevsky does not ground morality in divine commandment, at least not explicitly in this novel. He grounds it in the structure of human existence, in the fact that we are relational beings who recognize each other as subjects, as ends in themselves rather than means. To murder another person is to treat that person as a thing, as an obstacle to be removed. And in doing so, one treats oneself as a thing, as a mere will to power without depth or limitation. This is what Raskolnikov cannot bear. He has reduced himself to a function, to an abstraction. And the more he tries to justify his act, the more hollow he becomes. One of the most striking features of crime and punishment is the way Raskolnikov seems driven to confess, even as he desperately tries to avoid being caught. Almost immediately after the murder, he begins to act in ways that draw suspicion. He returns to the scene of the crime. He engages in strange, provocative conversations with the police. He nearly confesses to strangers. He is simultaneously fleeing from and seeking confrontation with the truth of what he has done. This is not irrational behavior, though it may appear so. It is the logic of conscience. Conscience is not merely an internal voice that tells us right from wrong. It is the demand for acknowledgement, the insistence that what we have done must be brought into the open, recognized, and faced. To keep a crime secret is to remain trapped in it, to live in a state of permanent self-division. Confession is the only way to reunite the divided self, to make oneself whole again, even if that wholeness comes at the cost of punishment and suffering. Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator, understands this. He tells Raskolnikov that he knows he is the murderer and that he will eventually confess. Porfiry does not need physical evidence because he understands the psychology of guilt. He knows that Raskolnikov cannot live indefinitely with the burden of his secret, that the pressure will build until confession becomes inevitable. And he is right, but the confession does not come easily. Raskolnikov resists for as long as he can. He wavers, postpones, tries to find alternatives. He is torn between pride and guilt, between the desire to justify himself and the need for atonement. The turning point comes through his relationship with Sonya. Sonya herself has transgressed in the eyes of society by becoming a prostitute, but she does not regard herself as guilty in the same way Raskolnikov regards himself. She has done what she has done out of necessity, to save her family from starvation. She bears her suffering with humility and faith. She reads to Raskolnikov the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John, the story of a dead man brought back to life. The symbolism is clear. Raskolnikov is dead, spiritually dead, and he must be resurrected. But resurrection requires first a recognition of death, an acknowledgement that one is lost and cannot save oneself. Confession in Dostoevsky's novels is never simply a legal or social act. It is a metaphysical act, a movement from concealment to disclosure, from isolation to relation, from death to life. When Raskolnikov finally confesses to Sonya, he kneels and kisses her foot. He is not merely telling her a fact. He is exposing himself completely, placing himself at her mercy, acknowledging his need for her love and forgiveness. And when he later confesses publicly at the police station, he is not simply submitting to the law. He is accepting responsibility, stepping back into the human community from which his crime had exiled him. This is why the epilogue is so important. Raskolnikov's legal punishment, exile to Siberia, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of his redemption. In Siberia, he is stripped of his pride, his theories, his self-justifications. He is reduced to the bare fact of his existence, and it is only there, in that extremity, that he can begin to recover his humanity. The epilogue hints that this recovery is happening through his love for Sonya and through his growing openness to faith. But Dostoevsky does not depict the process in detail. He leaves it as a promise, a possibility, an opening toward the future. The problem of confession also raises the question of what Raskolnikov is confessing to. On the surface, he is confessing to murder. But on a deeper level, he is confessing to a failure of love, a failure to recognize the pawnbroker and Lizaveta as persons, a failure to see that no theory or calculation can justify the destruction of a human life. He is confessing to his own pride, his belief that he was extraordinary, that he could stand above the moral law and remake himself according to his will. And he is confessing to his despair, his sense that life is meaningless and that therefore nothing matters. This despair is perhaps the deepest sin in Dostoevsky's moral universe. It is the refusal of hope, the denial that redemption is possible, the belief that we are defined entirely by our past and cannot change. Raskolnikov's crime is not only the murder, it is the attempt to live as though he were not a person, but a thing, a will to power without depth or moral constraint, and his redemption begins when he allows himself to be vulnerable, to need, to love, to depend on another. This is what Sonya offers him, not judgment, not condemnation, but recognition and love. She sees him as he truly is, a suffering, broken human being, and she does not turn away. And that recognition, that refusal to turn away, is the beginning of his return to life. Dostoevsky's treatment of confession is profoundly Christian, but it is also deeply psychological. He anticipates many of the insights of modern depth psychology, particularly the idea that healing requires the verbal expression and integration of traumatic experience. But for Dostoevsky, confession is not just a therapeutic technique, it is an ethical and spiritual act. To confess is to take responsibility, to acknowledge one's guilt, to accept one's place in the moral order. It is to renounce the fantasy of self-sufficiency and to admit one's need for others, for community, for grace. This is why Raskolnikov's confession is not enough by itself. He must also accept punishment, undergo suffering, and be transformed through suffering. Dostoevsky does not romanticize suffering. He knows that it can crush and destroy, but he also believes that it can purify, that it can strip away pride and illusion and open the person to love and truth. This is the paradox at the heart of crime and punishment, that guilt and suffering, which seem like absolute evils, can become the means of redemption. Sonya Marmeladova is one of the most important figures in crime and punishment, and one of Dostoevsky's most memorable creations. She is young, physically frail, and has been forced into prostitution by poverty and family desperation. Her father, Marmeladov, is an alcoholic who has squandered the family's resources. Her stepmother, Katerina Ivanovna, is ill and overwhelmed. The family faces starvation, and Sonya takes the only path available to her. She sells her body to keep them alive. But despite the degradation of her situation, Sonya retains an extraordinary purity of spirit. She is not hardened or cynical. She does not hate those who use her or despise herself for what she must do. She accepts her suffering with humility and maintains an unshakable faith in God. She carries a worn copy of the New Testament and reads it constantly. She believes in the resurrection, in forgiveness, in the possibility of redemption, even for the worst sinners. And it is this faith that makes her the moral and spiritual center of the novel. Raskolnikov is drawn to Sonya not despite her prostitution, but because of it. He recognizes in her a kindred transgressor, someone who has crossed a boundary, who knows what it means to violate social norms and live outside respectability. He says to her, "You have transgressed, you have destroyed a life, your own life." But he quickly realizes that Sonya's transgression is fundamentally different from his. She has sacrificed herself for others. He has sacrificed others for himself. She has acted out of love. He has acted out of pride. She bears her suffering willingly as a form of martyrdom. He is crushed by his suffering and seeks to escape it through rationalization and denial. The contrast between them is stark, and it forces Raskolnikov to confront the emptiness of his theories. Sonya does not argue with him. She does not offer philosophical refutations. She simply lives her faith, and in her presence, Raskolnikov's justifications begin to crumble. The scene in which Sonya reads to Raskolnikov the story of Lazarus is one of the most powerful in the novel. Raskolnikov asks her to read, and she chooses the passage from the Gospel of John in which Lazarus, dead for 4 days, is called out of the tomb. Sonya reads haltingly, her voice shaking, but as she continues, her conviction grows. She reads with passion and hope, as though she herself is calling Raskolnikov out of the grave. The symbolism is unmistakable. Raskolnikov is Lazarus, spiritually dead, bound in the grave clothes of his guilt and pride. And Sonya is offering him the possibility of resurrection, the hope that he can be brought back to life. But resurrection is not automatic. It requires faith, repentance, and the willingness to suffer. Sonya urges Raskolnikov to confess, to accept his punishment, to embrace his suffering as a path to redemption. She tells him that suffering can redeem. This is the heart of Dostoevsky's Christian vision, that suffering, freely accepted, can become a means of transformation and grace. But what does redemption mean in this context? It is not simply forgiveness or the cancellation of guilt. It is the restoration of personhood, the recovery of the capacity to love and be loved. Raskolnikov's crime has cut him off from others. He has made himself a stranger, an outcast, even though no one yet knows what he has done. His guilt is a wall that separates him from every other person. He cannot be present to his mother, to his sister, to anyone. He is trapped in his own consciousness, endlessly circling his crime, unable to move forward or back. Redemption means breaking down that wall, stepping back into relation, allowing oneself to be seen and known, and this requires confession. Confession is the act of making oneself visible, of refusing to hide, of trusting that love is stronger than judgment. Sonya embodies this love. She does not excuse Raskolnikov's crime. She recognizes its horror, but she also recognizes his suffering, his humanity, his capacity for change, and she refuses to abandon him. This is unconditional love, love that does not depend on the worthiness of its object, but is freely given. And it is this love that begins to heal Raskolnikov. The redemption Dostoevsky envisions is not quick or easy. The epilogue makes clear that Raskolnikov's transformation is just beginning. Even in Siberia, he remains proud and resistant. He does not fully understand what has happened to him or what he must become. But he has taken the first steps. He has confessed. He has accepted punishment. He has opened himself to Sonya's love. and he has begun to feel something new, a desire for life, a glimmer of hope, a sense that he is not entirely alone. Dostoevsky suggests that this is the work of grace, but he does not depict it as miraculous or sudden. Grace, in his novels, operates through the ordinary events of life, through suffering and encounter, through the slow, painful process of self-knowledge and transformation. Sonya's role in this process is crucial. She is not a savior. She cannot redeem Raskolnikov by herself, but she can witness his suffering, love him despite his crime, and point him toward the possibility of redemption. And that is enough. That is what makes the difference between despair and hope, between death and life. The Idiot, published in 1869, represents Dostoevsky's attempt to depict a perfectly good human being and to explore what would happen if such a person entered the morally corrupt world of modern society. The protagonist, Prince Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, is a young nobleman who has spent most of his life in Switzerland, recovering from a severe epileptic condition that left him in a state described as idiocy. As the novel opens, Myshkin is returning to Russia for the first time in many years. He is innocent, naive, and utterly without guile. He trusts everyone, speaks with complete honesty, and acts out of pure compassion and goodness. He has no ambition, no pride, no desire for wealth or status. He is, in Dostoevsky's conception, a positively beautiful person, but this beauty is also his tragedy. Myshkin's goodness makes him vulnerable, and the world he enters is not prepared to receive him. The people around him are driven by passion, pride, resentment, and calculation. They do not understand Myshkin, and their attempts to love him or possess him lead to disaster. The novel revolves around two women, Nastasia Filipovna Barashkova and Aglaya Ivanovna Yepanchina. Nastasia Filipovna is beautiful, intelligent, and deeply wounded. She was seduced and kept as a mistress by a wealthy older man when she was still a child. She has internalized society's judgment of her as fallen, ruined, unworthy of love. She oscillates between pride and self-loathing, between the desire for revenge and the longing for purity. Myshkin recognizes her suffering and offers her his love and respect. He does not judge her. He sees her as a person, not as a scandal. But Nastasia cannot accept his love. She is convinced that she would only corrupt him, that she is too damaged to be redeemed. Aglaya Ivanovna is young, passionate, and idealistic. She falls in love with Myshkin's goodness, but she also wants to possess him, to make him hers. She does not fully understand him, and her love is mixed with pride and willfulness. The tension between these two women and Myshkin's inability to choose between them drives the plot toward its tragic conclusion. Myshkin's goodness is Christ-like in its purity and compassion, and Dostoevsky clearly intends the comparison. Myshkin forgives everyone, empathizes with everyone, and tries to save everyone. But he is not a triumphant savior. He is a failure. By the end of the novel, Nastasia Filipovna has been murdered by Rogozhin, a wealthy merchant who loves her with a violent, possessive passion. Aglaya has married unwisely and been humiliated. Myshkin himself has relapsed into his former state of idiocy, unable to speak or recognize anyone. He is cared for in Switzerland by his benefactor, and the novel ends with him as he began, innocent, helpless, removed from the world. The message is clear. Pure goodness cannot survive in a fallen world. It is either destroyed or it retreats into passivity and incomprehension. Myshkin's tragedy is not that he is weak or foolish. It is that the world is too corrupt, too violent, too bound up in its passions and resentments to make room for innocence. But The Idiot is not simply a pessimistic novel. It is also a profound meditation on the nature of goodness and its relationship to power. Myshkin has no power in the ordinary sense. He cannot control events or bend others to his will. He cannot even protect the people he loves, but he has a different kind of power. The power of presence, of recognition, of unconditional acceptance. When Myshkin looks at someone, he sees them as they truly are, not as society sees them, not as they see themselves. He sees their suffering, their beauty, their humanity, and this recognition, even if it does not save them, transforms them in some way. Nastasia Philippovna says that Myshkin is the first person who has ever treated her with genuine respect, who has seen her as a person rather than an object. Aglaya says that Myshkin makes her want to be better. Rogozhin, for all his violence, feels a strange kinship with Myshkin and a guilt that he cannot shake. Myshkin's goodness is a mirror that reveals the moral state of everyone around him. It makes visible the compromises, the cruelties, the self-deceptions that people use to survive in a corrupt society. And this is both beautiful and terrible. Dostoevsky's depiction of Myshkin raises difficult questions. Is it possible to be good in the way Myshkin is good? Or does goodness require a kind of otherworldliness that makes one unfit for life? Is Myshkin's failure a condemnation of the world or a warning about the limits of innocence? Dostoevsky does not answer these questions directly. He presents Myshkin with a mixture of admiration, pity, and ambivalence. He seems to suggest that Myshkin represents an ideal that we cannot fully realize, but also cannot afford to forget. Myshkin is a reminder of what we have lost, of what we betray every time we act out of self-interest or fear. He is a reproach to our compromises and a call to something higher. But he is also a warning that goodness without wisdom, without the ability to navigate the complexities of the world, is impotent and perhaps even dangerous. Myshkin's love wounds as much as it heals. His inability to choose between Nastasia and Aglaya contributes to the catastrophe. His innocence prevents him from seeing the full consequences of his actions. And in the end, he is as much a victim of his goodness as a witness to it. One of the most famous lines in The Idiot is Myshkin's assertion that beauty will save the world. The line appears in the novel not as a confident declaration, but as a question. The young nihilist Ippolit asks Myshkin whether it is true that he once said beauty will save the world. Myshkin does not answer directly. He is embarrassed, and the conversation moves on. But the line has haunted readers and critics ever since. What does it mean? And does Dostoevsky believe it? The novel itself seems to both affirm and undermine the claim. On one hand, beauty in the form of Myshkin's goodness and Nastasia Philippovna's suffering does reveal truth and evoke compassion. It makes visible the moral and spiritual realities that are usually hidden beneath the surface of social life. On the other hand, beauty does not save anyone. Nastasia is murdered. Myshkin relapses into idiocy. Aglaya is humiliated. The world is not redeemed by beauty. It is indifferent to it, or it destroys it. To understand what Dostoevsky might mean by beauty, we must turn to his broader metaphysical and theological views. For Dostoevsky, beauty is not simply aesthetic appeal or formal harmony. It is a manifestation of the divine, a glimpse of the transcendent order that underlies and judges the fallen world. True beauty is inseparable from goodness and truth. It is what Russian religious philosophy would call the sensible manifestation of the ideal. When we encounter genuine beauty, we are confronted with something that exceeds our ordinary experience, something that calls us beyond ourselves and our petty concerns. Beauty awakens longing, a desire for something more, something higher. And this longing is the beginning of salvation, because it opens us to grace, to the possibility of transformation. But beauty is also dangerous. It is vulnerable, fragile, easily destroyed, and it can be misused, turned into an object of possession or exploitation. Nastasia Philippovna's physical beauty has been her curse. It made her desirable to the man who seduced her, and it makes her an object of obsession for the men who pursue her. She cannot simply be herself. She is always being looked at, judged, desired, and this objectification drives her deeper into despair. Myshkin's beauty is different. It is moral and spiritual rather than physical, but it is equally vulnerable. His goodness makes him an easy target for manipulation and misunderstanding. People project onto him their own desires and fantasies. Some see him as a fool, others as a saint. Few see him as he actually is, a human being struggling to live according to his deepest convictions in a world that does not share those convictions. Myshkin's vulnerability is not a weakness, it is the condition of his goodness. To be good in the way Myshkin is good requires openness, trust, the willingness to be hurt. It requires refusing to protect oneself through cynicism, manipulation, or power. And this refusal makes one defenseless. Dostoevsky understood that genuine love and goodness are always vulnerable, that they require a kind of nakedness before the other, a willingness to be exposed and possibly rejected. This is why Myshkin cannot survive in the social world of St. Petersburg. He cannot play the games that others play. He cannot calculate, strategize, or defend himself. He can only love, and his love is too pure, too absolute to be sustained in a fallen world. The failure of innocence is thus not a failure of goodness itself, but a revelation of the world's fallenness. Myshkin's tragedy is not that he was wrong to be good. It is that goodness alone, without power and without cunning, is not enough to redeem a world bent on self-destruction. Dostoevsky seems to be suggesting that salvation requires not only goodness but also wisdom, not only love but also justice, not only innocence but also knowledge of evil. Myshkin knows suffering abstractly, he empathizes with it, but he does not fully understand the depths of human wickedness, the capacity for cruelty and self-deception that drives so much of human behavior. He is shocked when he encounters it, and he does not know how to respond. This is why he fails. He cannot meet evil on its own ground. He can only oppose it with love, and love is not always enough. This is a deeply tragic insight, but it is also realistic. Dostoevsky loved Myshkin, but he did not idealize him. He showed his limitations, his failures, his inability to navigate the complexities of moral life, and in doing so, he raised a question that runs through all his work. How can we be good without being naive? How can we recognize and resist evil without becoming evil ourselves? The question of beauty and its relationship to salvation remains unresolved in The Idiot. Dostoevsky does not give us a clear answer. He presents us instead with a paradox. Beauty reveals truth, awakens longing, and calls us to something higher. But beauty is also vulnerable, easily corrupted, easily destroyed. It is not enough by itself to save the world. Yet without beauty, without the glimpse of transcendence that it offers, the world would be utterly bereft of hope. Beauty is both necessary and insufficient. It is a promise that cannot be fulfilled in this life, a pointer toward a reality that exceeds our grasp. And this perhaps is what Dostoevsky means when he has Myshkin speak of beauty saving the world. Not that beauty will save the world in any immediate or obvious way, but that beauty keeps alive the hope of salvation, the faith that the world is not ultimately meaningless, that there is something beyond suffering and corruption, something worth striving for even if we cannot fully attain it. Beauty, in this sense, is eschatological. It points toward a future redemption, a healing of the world that is not yet present but that we can glimpse in moments of grace and transcendence. Demons, also translated as the possessed or the devils, is perhaps Dostoevsky's darkest and most politically urgent novel. It was published serially between 1871 and 1872, and it was directly inspired by the Nechayev affair, a real event in which a young revolutionary named Sergei Nechayev orchestrated the murder of a student, Ivan Ivanov, who had tried to leave his revolutionary cell. Nechayev was a fanatic who believed that the ends justified any means, that morality was a bourgeois prejudice, and that the destruction of the existing social order required absolute ruthlessness. He wrote a pamphlet called The Catechism of a Revolutionary, which declared that the revolutionary must be prepared to destroy everything and everyone, including himself, for the sake of the revolution. Dostoevsky was horrified by the Nechayev affair. He saw in it the logical culmination of the nihilistic and revolutionary ideologies that had been brewing in Russia since the 1860s. And he set out to write a novel that would expose the spiritual and moral bankruptcy of those ideologies. The novel is set in a provincial Russian town and follows the activities of a group of revolutionaries led by Pyotr Stepanovich Verkhovensky, a ruthless and cynical manipulator modelled on Nechayev. Pyotr is the son of Stepan Trofimovich Verkhovensky, an ageing liberal idealist of the 1840s generation. Stepan represents the well-meaning but ineffectual progressives who believed in reason, enlightenment, and gradual reform. Pyotr represents the next generation, which has rejected his father's idealism and embraced nihilism and violence. Pyotr does not believe in the revolution as a moral cause. He believes in it as a means to power. He is willing to lie, manipulate, betray, and kill to achieve his goals. He gathers around him a group of conspirators, each with their own grievances and delusions, and he binds them together through a shared crime, the murder of a member of the group who threatens to expose them. The murder is meant to seal their solidarity and their commitment to the revolutionary cause. But it also reveals the emptiness and horror at the heart of their enterprise. The central figure of the novel is not Pyotr, but Nikolai Vsevolodovich Stavrogin, a charismatic and enigmatic aristocrat who has returned to the town after years abroad. Stavrogin is beautiful, intelligent, and utterly empty. He has experimented with every philosophy, every vice, every extreme of behaviour, and he has found nothing that gives his life meaning. He is the embodiment of nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, that all values are arbitrary, that existence is absurd. Pyotr worships Stavrogin and believes that he can use him as the figurehead for the revolution. He imagines Stavrogin as a new leader, a strong figure who will inspire fear and devotion. But Stavrogin is incapable of commitment. He cannot believe in anything, not even in himself. He has seduced, betrayed, and destroyed everyone who has loved him, not out of cruelty, but out of indifference. And this indifference makes him more terrifying than Pyotr's active malice. By the end of the novel, Stavrogin commits suicide, leaving a note that expresses neither regret nor explanation, only a profound emptiness. Demons is a novel about ideas and their consequences. Dostoevsky shows how abstract ideologies, divorced from moral reality and individual conscience, lead to violence and dehumanization. The revolutionaries in the novel do not see people. They see categories, functions, obstacles, and instruments. They have reduced human beings to means for an ideological end, and this reduction makes murder not only possible, but logical. Pyotr justifies the murder of Shatov, the former member of the revolutionary cell, by arguing that it is necessary for the cause. He appeals to the greater good, to the future that the revolution will bring. But Dostoevsky shows that this appeal is a lie. The revolutionaries do not care about the future. They care about power, about the thrill of transgression, about the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The revolution is not a means to justice. It is an expression of resentment, nihilism, and the will to destroy. And it consumes everyone it touches. By the end of the novel, the revolutionary cell has collapsed. Shatov and his wife have been murdered. Kirillov, a philosophical nihilist who believes that killing himself will prove that man is God, has committed suicide. Stavrogin has hanged himself, Pyotr has fled, and the town is left in ruins, haunted by the knowledge of what has happened. The novel is prophetic in its diagnosis of totalitarian violence. Dostoevsky understood, decades before the Russian Revolution, that revolutionary movements grounded in abstract ideology and contemptuous of individual conscience would inevitably produce terror and destruction. He understood that the promise of future utopia could be used to justify any atrocity in the present, that the dream of creating a perfect society would lead to the nightmare of mass murder. And he understood that this violence was not an accidental byproduct of revolutionary fervour, but its essential logic. Once you believe that history has a direction, that you understand its laws, and that you are justified in using any means to bring about its fulfillment, then every individual person becomes expendable. The person is no longer an end in herself, but a means to the revolutionary end. And once that reduction has taken place, murder becomes not a crime but a duty, not a violation but a necessity. This is the logic that Dostoevsky exposes in Demons, and it is a logic that would be enacted on a vast scale in the 20th century. One of the most chilling passages in Demons occurs during a clandestine meeting of the revolutionary conspirators. A character named Shigalyov presents his vision for the future society. Shigalyov is a theorist, a systematic thinker who has worked out the logic of revolution with mathematical precision. He begins his presentation by admitting that he has arrived at a paradox. Starting from unlimited freedom, he says, "I arrive at unlimited despotism." He explains that true equality can be achieved only by dividing humanity into two unequal groups. 1/10 will have absolute freedom and authority over the remaining 9/10, who will be reduced to a herd, deprived of individuality, and conditioned to obey. This system, Shigalyov argues, is the only way to create a stable and harmonious society. The masses must be made equal by being made equally unfree. They must be kept ignorant, dependent, and docile. They will be provided for materially, but they will have no voice, no autonomy, no capacity for dissent. The ruling elite, meanwhile, will be free to think, to act, to shape the future. But they too will be bound by the logic of the system. They must be ruthless, calculating, and willing to sacrifice anyone for the sake of maintaining order. Shigalyov's system is a dystopian vision, and it anticipates the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century with uncanny accuracy. Dostoevsky wrote Demons 50 years before the Russian Revolution and nearly 70 years before the full horrors of Stalinism became known. Yet he understood the inner logic of totalitarianism, the way that utopian ideals can be perverted into systems of absolute control, the way that the promise of liberation can become the justification for slavery. Shigalyov's paradox, starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism, captures the essential insight that revolutionary movements that begin by promising freedom often end by destroying it, because they refuse to accept the limitations of human nature and the complexity of moral life. They believe that they can remake humanity, that they can create a new kind of person who is rational, selfless, and obedient. And to achieve this, they are willing to use any means: propaganda, terror, violence, mass murder. They are willing to sacrifice the present generation for the sake of the future, to treat living persons as raw material for the construction of utopia. Dostoevsky saw that this logic is not peculiar to one ideology or one political movement. It is inherent in any system that claims to possess absolute truth, that refuses to recognize the irreducible value of the individual person, and that subordinates morality to a supposedly higher goal. Shigalyov is a caricature, and his system is absurd in its bluntness. but the principles he articulates are present, in more subtle forms, in many progressive and revolutionary movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Dostoevsky's critique is not a defense of conservatism or reaction. He hated the status quo as much as the revolutionaries did. But he believed that the cure they proposed was worse than the disease, that their vision of liberation was actually a vision of enslavement, and that their refusal to recognize moral limits would lead to catastrophe. The novel's prophetic power lies in its diagnosis of the spiritual sickness that makes totalitarianism possible. That sickness is nihilism, the belief that nothing has intrinsic value, that all values are arbitrary constructs, and that therefore anything is permitted. Once this belief takes hold, morality becomes a game, conscience becomes an obstacle, and other persons become mere objects to be used or discarded. The other conspirators react to Shigalyov's presentation with varying degrees of enthusiasm and unease. Pyotr is delighted. He does not care about the theoretical details. He cares about the fact that Shigalyov has provided a rationale for absolute power. Others are troubled, but do not know how to articulate their objections. They sense that something is wrong, that Shigalyov's system violates some fundamental principle, but they cannot say what that principle is. This is the tragedy of the revolutionaries in Demons. They have cut themselves off from the moral traditions that might have restrained them. They have rejected religion, rejected conventional morality, rejected the wisdom of the past, and in doing so, they have left themselves defenseless against the logic of nihilism. They have no grounds on which to resist Shigalyov's vision because they share his premises. They too believe that values are arbitrary, that morality is a social construct, that the end justifies the means. And so they slide, step by step, into complicity with evil. By the time they realize what they have become, it is too late. They are bound together by guilt, by fear, by the shared knowledge of the crime they have committed, and they have no way out except destruction. Shigalyov's paradox also reveals something deeper about the relationship between freedom and order. The revolutionaries begin with a demand for freedom, for the liberation of humanity from oppression and constraint. But because they misunderstand what freedom is, because they think of it as the absence of limitation rather than as the capacity for self-determination, they end up creating a system more oppressive than anything they sought to overthrow. True freedom requires structure, requires moral law, requires the recognition of limits. It requires that we acknowledge our dependence on others, our need for community, our place within a larger order. The revolutionaries reject all of this. They want absolute freedom, freedom without constraint, freedom without responsibility. And they discover that such freedom is impossible. In the absence of moral constraint, the strong dominate the weak. In the absence of law, might makes right. And so they create Shigalyov's system, a world in which freedom exists only for the few who rule, and the many are reduced to slavery. This is the inevitable outcome of every attempt to achieve absolute freedom. It collapses into absolute tyranny. Nikolai Vsevolodovich Stavrogin is one of Dostoevsky's most complex and disturbing creations. He is the gravitational center of Demons, the figure around whom all the other characters orbit, yet he is also strangely absent, hollow, unreachable. Nearly every character in the novel is obsessed with Stavrogin in one way or another. Pyotr Verkovensky sees him as the future leader of the revolution. Shatov, the former revolutionary who has turned to Slavophile nationalism and Orthodox Christianity, sees him as a potential savior of Russia. Kirillov, the philosophical nihilist, considers Stavrogin his spiritual teacher. Varvara Petrovna, Stavrogin's mother, adores him and refuses to see his faults. Liza Tushin is in love with him. Maria Lebyatkina, a simple-minded woman, is secretly his wife. Dasha Shatova, a young protege of Varvara Petrovna, is devoted to him. Yet despite all this attention, Stavrogin remains an enigma. He does not reveal himself. He does not commit himself. He watches, listens, occasionally acts, but always with a kind of detachment that makes it impossible to know what he truly thinks or feels. Stavrogin's emptiness is not accidental. It is the essence of his character. He has lost the capacity to believe in anything, to care about anything, to feel anything with genuine intensity. He has tried everything: philosophy, debauchery, cruelty, asceticism, love, hatred, and nothing has touched him. He is incapable of suffering in the way that Raskolnikov suffers, or of loving in the way that Myshkin loves. He is beyond suffering and beyond love, and this makes him a kind of living death. Dostoevsky gives us glimpses of Stavrogin's past, and they are horrifying. He has committed acts of extraordinary cruelty, apparently out of curiosity or boredom rather than passion. The most shocking revelation comes in a chapter titled At Tikhon's, which was censored and not published during Dostoevsky's lifetime. In this chapter, Stavrogin confesses to Bishop Tikhon that he seduced a young girl and then allowed her to hang herself without intervening. He describes the event with chilling detachment, as though he were recounting an experiment. Tikhon is horrified and tells Stavrogin that his greatest sin is not the crime itself, but his lack of repentance, his inability to feel genuine remorse. Stavrogin admits that he does not feel what he thinks he should feel. He is numb, dead inside. Stavrogin's condition is the ultimate expression of nihilism. Nihilism is not simply the denial of God or the rejection of moral values. It is the experience of meaninglessness, the sense that nothing matters, that existence is absurd, that all striving is futile. The nihilist has passed through doubt into despair. He has confronted the void and been unable to turn away from it. Stavrogin embodies this despair. He is beautiful, intelligent, cultured, wealthy. He has every advantage, but none of it means anything to him. He cannot connect with others because he has no self to offer. He is a shell, a mask, a mirror that reflects others' desires and projections, but has no content of its own. And this emptiness is not liberating, it is suffocating. Stavrogin is trapped in his own indifference, and he knows it. He longs for something, anything, that would break through his numbness and make him feel alive. But nothing works. Not love, not crime, not philosophy, not faith. He is beyond rescue. Dostoevsky's portrayal of Stavrogin is profoundly pessimistic, but it is also a warning. Stavrogin represents what happens when the revolt against meaning is taken to its logical conclusion. He is the end result of the process that begins with the underground man's assertion of irrational freedom and continues through Raskolnikov's transgression. He has achieved absolute freedom, freedom from all constraints, all values, all commitments, and that freedom has destroyed him. He has become nothing. Dostoevsky seems to be saying that freedom without meaning, without love, without some commitment to something beyond the self, is not freedom at all. It is annihilation. Stavrogin's suicide at the end of the novel is not a tragedy in the classical sense. It is not the fall of a great man. It is the inevitable conclusion of a life that has already ended, the formal acknowledgement of a death that occurred long before. In his suicide note, Stavrogin writes that he is taking his own life because he is no longer interested in living, not because he is suffering or because he has been defeated. He simply has no reason to continue. And this absence of reason, this absolute indifference, is more terrifying than any passion or despair. Stavrogin also represents the spiritual void at the center of the revolutionary movement. He is the hidden truth that Pyotr tries to conceal, the emptiness that the revolutionaries are fleeing from. They fill their lives with activity, with conspiracy, with grand schemes for transforming society. But beneath all the noise and fury, there is nothing. They have no genuine commitments, no real loves, no authentic faith. They are nihilists playing at revolution, trying to fill the void within themselves by destroying the world around them. And Stavrogin is their mirror, showing them what they really are. This is why his suicide is so devastating to the revolutionary cell. It exposes the futility of their enterprise, the fact that they are building on sand, that there is nothing substantial at the foundation of their project. The revolution, Dostoevsky suggests, is not motivated by love of humanity or desire for justice. It is motivated by resentment, by envy, by the nihilistic impulse to destroy, and it will consume everyone who participates in it, leaving only emptiness in its wake. The Brothers Karamazov is Dostoevsky's final and greatest novel, a vast exploration of faith, doubt, freedom, suffering, love, and responsibility. It was published serially between January 1879 and November 1880, just a few months before Dostoevsky's death. The novel is both a family drama and a metaphysical inquiry. It tells the story of the Karamazov family, Fyodor Pavlovich, a depraved and dissolute landowner, and his three legitimate sons, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, along with Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son who serves as the family's cook. The murder of Fyodor Pavlovich is the central event around which the plot revolves, but the novel is concerned less with the mechanics of the crime than with the moral and spiritual questions it raises. Who is responsible for the murder? What does it mean to be guilty? Can suffering be justified? Is faith possible in a world that permits such horror and injustice? These are the questions that drive the novel, and Dostoevsky does not pretend to offer simple answers. The three legitimate brothers represent three different responses to the problem of existence. Dmitri, the eldest, is passionate, sensual, and impulsive. He lives by his appetites and emotions. He is capable of great generosity and great cruelty. He loves without restraint, hates without calculation, and suffers without understanding why. He is in many ways the most fully human of the brothers, the one most in touch with the raw energies of life. But he is also the most vulnerable to chaos and self-destruction. Ivan, the second brother, is an intellectual and a rationalist. He is brilliant, articulate, and tormented by doubt. He rejects the world as it is and argues that if God exists and permits the suffering of innocent children, then God is unjust and the world is unacceptable. Ivan's rebellion is not against the existence of God, but against the moral order that God has supposedly created. He cannot reconcile the fact of suffering with the idea of a benevolent creator, and he refuses to accept any theodicy that tries to justify suffering by appealing to some greater good. Alyosha, the youngest brother, is a novice monk and the moral center of the novel. He is gentle, compassionate, and deeply religious. He does not argue for faith, he lives it. He loves everyone, even his degraded father. He believes in the possibility of redemption, in the power of active love, and in the ultimate meaningfulness of existence, despite all evidence to the contrary. The novel is structured around a series of confrontations and dialogues that explore the tensions among these three worldviews. Dmitri's world of passion and instinct, Ivan's world of reason and revolt, and Alyosha's world of faith and love are not presented as equally valid options among which the reader is free to choose. Dostoevsky clearly privileges Alyosha's perspective, but he does not make it easy. He gives Ivan the most powerful and compelling arguments. He allows Ivan to voice the deepest doubts and the most devastating critiques of faith. And he shows that Alyosha's faith is not naive or uncritical. Alyosha is tempted, tested, and shaken. He witnesses the corruption of the church, the suffering of the innocent, the failure of his beloved elder Zosima to perform a miracle. And yet he does not lose his faith. He emerges from his crisis with a deeper, more mature understanding of what faith means. he learns that faith is not certainty, not the possession of answers, but a commitment, a way of being in the world, a response to the call of love. The murder of Fyodor Pavlovich serves as the occasion for a profound meditation on guilt and responsibility. Dmitri is accused of the murder and convicted, even though he did not commit it. The actual murderer is Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son, who kills Fyodor at the instigation, or at least with the implicit permission of Ivan. But the novel asks, who is really responsible? Is it Smerdyakov, who wielded the weapon? Is it Ivan, whose philosophical nihilism provided the rationale? Is it Dmitri, whose violent hatred of his father created the atmosphere in which murder became thinkable? Or is it Fyodor himself, whose depravity and cruelty poisoned everyone around him? Dostoevsky suggests that all of them bear responsibility, in different ways and to different degrees. And he extends the question further. Are we all responsible for the sins of others? Are we all implicated in the evil that occurs in the world? This is one of the novel's deepest insights. Responsibility is not individual and isolated. It is collective and relational. We are bound together in a web of interdependence, and what any one of us does affects all the others. To deny this is to deny our humanity. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion is articulated most fully in a conversation with Alyosha in a tavern, in the chapter titled Rebellion. Ivan begins by saying that he accepts God, he accepts that God exists, and that God created the world. But he does not accept the world. He does not accept the suffering that pervades it, particularly the suffering of innocent children. He tells Alyosha a series of horrifying stories about children who have been tortured, abused, and killed by adults. These stories are based on real cases that Dostoevsky had read about in newspapers. Ivan recounts them in excruciating detail. A 5-year-old girl locked in a freezing outhouse by her parents, crying to God for help that never comes. A serf boy torn apart by hunting dogs while his mother is forced to watch. Ivan asks Alyosha, how can any future harmony, any ultimate good, justify such suffering? Even if the end result is a perfect world in which everyone is happy and reconciled, how can that compensate for the tears of one tortured child? Ivan's argument is devastating. He is not denying that some kind of cosmic harmony might be achieved. He is saying that even if it is achieved, it is not worth the price. He will not accept a ticket to paradise if the price is the suffering of innocence. He famously says, I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It is not worth the tears of that one tortured child. This is not atheism in the ordinary sense. Ivan does not deny God's existence. He denies God's justice. He refuses to participate in a creation that is built on such a foundation. He returns his ticket. This is one of the most powerful expressions of the problem of theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the existence of a good and omnipotent God with the reality of evil and suffering in all of literature. Ivan's rebellion is not frivolous or self-serving. It is moral. It is grounded in compassion and a refusal to compromise with injustice. And Dostoevsky takes it seriously. He does not dismiss Ivan's arguments. He allows them to stand, in all their force, because they articulate a doubt that Dostoevsky himself felt deeply. But Dostoevsky also shows the consequences of Ivan's rebellion. Ivan's position is consistent and rigorous, but it is also sterile and ultimately destructive. If the world is unacceptable, if God's creation is unjust, then what follows? Ivan's answer is encapsulated in the phrase that haunts the novel. If there is no God, everything is permitted. Ivan does not say this directly, but it is implied in his arguments and stated explicitly by others who claim to be following his logic. If God does not exist, or if God is unjust, then there is no transcendent moral law. Morality becomes a human invention, a set of conventions that have no binding authority. And if that is the case, then why should we restrain ourselves? Why not pursue power, pleasure, or self-interest without limit? Why not kill if killing serves our purposes? This is the logic that Smerdyakov adopts. Smerdyakov is Ivan's shadow, the embodiment of Ivan's philosophy taken to its brutal conclusion. Smerdyakov murders Fyodor Pavlovich, and then tells Ivan that he did it because Ivan wanted him to, because Ivan's philosophy made it permissible. Ivan is horrified. He did not intend this. He did not want murder. But Smerdyakov insists that Ivan is responsible, that his ideas have consequences, that he cannot separate his philosophy from its implications. Ivan's crisis comes to a head in the chapter titled The Devil, in which Ivan is visited by a hallucination of the devil. The devil is shabby, second-rate, and tedious. He mocks Ivan, tells him stories, and engages him in philosophical banter. Ivan knows that the devil is a projection of his own mind, a symptom of his illness and guilt. But he cannot dismiss him. The devil represents the logic of Ivan's own doubts and denials, the voice that tells him that nothing matters, that morality is a fiction, that he is free to do as he pleases. And Ivan is terrified because he recognizes that this voice is his own. He has spent years constructing a rational, coherent argument against the world, and now he discovers that this argument has led him to nihilism and complicity in murder. He did not kill Fyodor with his own hands, but his ideas created the conditions in which murder became possible. And he cannot escape the guilt. Ivan's breakdown is one of the most intense psychological portraits in Dostoevsky's work. It shows the cost of a purely intellectual rebellion against existence, the way that abstract ideas can become lived realities, and the way that the refusal of faith can lead not to freedom, but to madness and despair. Ivan's rebellion also raises profound questions about the nature of love and compassion. Ivan loves humanity in the abstract. He is outraged by the suffering of children, moved by injustice, committed to the idea of human dignity. But he cannot love actual human beings. He is isolated, cut off from genuine relationships, unable to connect with others in any meaningful way. His compassion is theoretical rather than practical. He feels for humanity, but cannot feel with individual persons. This is the paradox of Ivan's position. His rebellion is motivated by love, but it leads to isolation. He wants to defend the innocent, but he ends up complicit in murder. He seeks justice, but he creates only more suffering. Dostoevsky suggests that abstract love, love divorced from concrete relationships and practical action, is not really love at all. It is a form of pride, a way of elevating oneself above the messy, compromised reality of actual human life. True love, the love that Zosima teaches and that Alyosha practices, is not abstract or theoretical. It is concrete, particular, embodied. It is the love that serves, that forgives, that bears with, that does not seek its own way. And it is this love, not Ivan's rebellion, that offers the possibility of redemption. Within the chapter titled Rebellion, Ivan tells Alyosha a prose poem he has composed, called The Grand Inquisitor. It is one of the most famous passages in all of Dostoevsky's work, and it has been interpreted and debated endlessly. The poem is set in 16th century Seville, during the height of the Spanish Inquisition. Christ returns to earth and walks the streets of the city. He is recognized by the people, who flock to him. He performs miracles, heals the sick, and raises a dead child. But he is arrested by the Inquisition and brought before the Grand Inquisitor, an elderly cardinal who has dedicated his life to the Church. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell. Christ does not speak, he only listens. The Grand Inquisitor delivers a long monologue in which he accuses Christ of loving humanity too much and understanding it too little. He argues that Christ made a terrible mistake by refusing the 3 temptations offered by the devil in the wilderness. The temptation to turn stones into bread, the temptation to jump off a cliff, and the temptation to bow down to Satan into bread, the temptation to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple and be saved by angels, and the temptation to rule over all the kingdoms of the world. The Grand Inquisitor explains that these 3 temptations represent 3 powers that can control humanity: miracle, mystery, and authority. Christ refused them because he wanted human beings to be free, to choose him out of love rather than compulsion. But the Grand Inquisitor says that this was a mistake. Human beings cannot bear freedom. They are weak, they are vicious, and they do not want to be responsible for their own choices. They want to be told what to believe, what to do, how to live. They want miracle, mystery, and authority. They want bread and security and the comfort of belonging to something larger than themselves. The Church, the Grand Inquisitor says, has corrected Christ's error. It has taken up the powers that Christ refused. It has given people what they need: certainty, order, and relief from the burden of freedom. And it has done this out of love, out of compassion for the weak. The Grand Inquisitor sees himself as a tragic hero, sacrificing his own salvation for the sake of humanity. He has taken upon himself the terrible knowledge that freedom is a curse, and he has built a system that shields people from that knowledge. He expects Christ to condemn him, to send him to hell. But Christ does not speak. He simply kisses the old man on his withered lips, and the Grand Inquisitor, shaken, opens the door and tells Christ to go and never come back. The Grand Inquisitor's argument is seductive and terrifying. He articulates a vision of authority that is not simply tyrannical but paternalistic, grounded in a kind of compassion for human weakness. He believes that most people are not capable of freedom, that freedom is a burden they cannot bear, and that they will be happier if they surrender their freedom in exchange for security and meaning. This is the logic of totalitarianism, but it is also the logic of any system that claims to know what is best for people and imposes that knowledge for their own good. The Grand Inquisitor's mistake, Dostoevsky suggests, is that he does not truly respect human beings. He sees them as children, as animals, as creatures to be managed rather than persons to be honoured. He has replaced love with control, and in doing so, he has betrayed the very Christ he claims to serve. Christ's silence in response to the Grand Inquisitor is crucial. He does not argue. He does not defend himself. He offers only the kiss, a gesture of love and forgiveness. This silence is an affirmation of freedom. Christ will not compel, will not manipulate, will not impose himself. He offers himself freely, and he leaves human beings free to accept or reject him. This is the essence of Dostoevsky's understanding of Christianity. Faith cannot be forced, it must be chosen. And the possibility of choosing wrong is the price of genuine freedom. The Grand Inquisitor has been interpreted in many ways. Some readers see it as Dostoevsky's critique of the Catholic Church, which he regarded as authoritarian and corrupt. Others see it as a critique of any religious or political institution that subordinates the individual to the collective. Still others see it as an expression of Dostoevsky's own doubts, a confession of the temptation to reject freedom in favour of order and security. The text is ambiguous enough to support all of these readings. What is clear is that Dostoevsky is wrestling with the most fundamental question: what does it mean to be human? Is freedom essential to our humanity, or is it a burden that we would be better off without? Dostoevsky's answer, embodied in Christ's kiss, is that freedom is essential, that personhood requires the capacity to choose, and that any system that denies this capacity, no matter how well-intentioned, is a betrayal of what we are. But he also recognizes the cost of this freedom. Freedom means the possibility of evil, of suffering, of wrong choices. It means living without certainty, without guarantees, without the comfort of knowing that everything will turn out well. And not everyone can bear this. The Grand Inquisitor's vision is false, but it addresses a real human need. And Dostoevsky does not pretend that need can be simply dismissed. If Ivan represents the voice of rebellion and doubt, and the Grand Inquisitor represents the temptation of authority, then Father Zosima represents the voice of faith and love. Zosima is the elder at the monastery where Alyosha is a novice. He is old, wise, and revered by many as a holy man. His teachings, recorded in the chapter titled From the Life of the Elder Zosima, form a counterpoint to Ivan's arguments. Where Ivan sees the world as unjust and unacceptable, Zosima sees it as fallen, but redeemable, as a place where suffering is real but not final, where love is possible and transformative. Zosima does not deny the reality of suffering. He has suffered himself, and he understands the depths of human pain, but he insists that suffering can be given meaning through love, through compassion, through the acceptance of responsibility. He teaches that we are all responsible for all, that no one can live in isolation, and that every act of kindness or cruelty ripples out and affects the whole of creation. Zosima's central teaching is what he calls active love. Active love is not an emotion or a feeling. It is a practice, a discipline, a way of being in the world. It means serving others concretely, attending to their needs, being present to their suffering. It means giving oneself without calculation, without expecting reward or recognition. Active love is difficult and demanding. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to endure frustration and failure. Zosima warns that active love can seem harsh and dreadful compared to the fantasies of love we indulge in. We imagine ourselves performing grand, heroic acts of self-sacrifice, and we feel noble and satisfied. But real love is mundane, repetitive, often thankless. It is washing dishes, caring for a sick child, listening to a complaint for the 100th time. And it is precisely in this mundane service that love becomes real, that it moves from fantasy to actuality. Zosima's teaching echoes the Christian emphasis on self-emptying, the surrender of ego and pride in order to make space for the other. But it is not masochistic or self-denying in a destructive sense. It is affirmative. It is grounded in the conviction that every person is infinitely valuable, made in the image of God and worthy of love. Zosima also speaks about the interconnectedness of all beings. He tells a story about his brother Markel, who died young but who experienced a spiritual awakening before his death. Markel said, "Everyone is really responsible to all for all and for everything." We do not understand this, Zosima explains, because we see ourselves as separate, isolated individuals. But in truth, we are all part of one body, and what affects one affects all. This is not merely a mystical or metaphorical claim. It is a recognition of the deep entanglement of human lives, the way that our actions have consequences far beyond what we intend or imagine, the way that guilt and suffering are shared, the way that redemption requires communal transformation. Zosima's vision is thus profoundly social and relational. He rejects the individualism that sees the self as a self-contained unit, and he insists that personhood is always already relational, constituted through our connections with others. This is why active love is so important. It is the practice that makes this interconnectedness visible and real. It is the way we acknowledge our responsibility for all and enact our solidarity with all. But Zosima's teaching is tested almost immediately after his death. In Orthodox tradition, the bodies of holy elders are believed to remain incorrupt, a sign of their sanctity. Alyosha and others expect that Zosima's body will not decay, but it does. It begins to smell almost immediately, and the odour fills the monastery. This is a scandal. The monks and townspeople who had revered Zosima now mock him. Some say that God has judged him, that he was not a true saint, that his teachings were false. Alyosha is devastated. His faith is shaken. He feels betrayed by God, as though a promise has been broken. He leaves the monastery in despair and wanders the town. He encounters Grushenka, a woman whom he had thought of as sinful and corrupting. But Grushenka is kind to him. She sees his suffering and comforts him without demanding anything in return. And through this encounter, through this concrete act of compassion, Alyosha begins to recover his faith. He returns to the monastery and keeps vigil over Zosima's body. As he listens to the reading of the Gospel, he falls into a kind of ecstatic vision. He sees Zosima at the wedding feast at Cana, the scene in which Christ performed his first miracle, turning water into wine. And he hears Zosima's voice telling him not to fear, that all will be well, that he must go into the world and practice active love. Alyosha emerges from this experience transformed. He goes outside, falls to the ground, and embraces the earth, weeping with joy. He has passed through doubt into a deeper, more resilient faith, and he has learned that faith is not about miracles or proofs. It is about love, about commitment, about saying yes to existence despite all the reasons to say no. Theodicy is the attempt to justify God's goodness in the face of evil and suffering. It is one of the oldest and most persistent problems in theology and philosophy. If God is omnipotent and benevolent, why does he permit suffering? Why do innocent children die? Why is there cruelty, injustice, and meaningless pain? Various answers have been proposed over the centuries. Some argue that suffering is a punishment for sin, that it is deserved. But this does not explain the suffering of innocence. Others argue that suffering is a test, a means of spiritual growth. But this seems to instrumentalize suffering, to treat it as a means to an end, and it does not explain why the test must be so severe. Still others argue that suffering is the result of human free will, that God permits it because he respects our freedom, and that a world with free will is better than a world without it, even if freedom leads to evil. This is the free will theodicy, and it has considerable force. But it still leaves questions unanswered. Why does God not intervene to prevent the worst atrocities? Why must children suffer for the sins of adults? Dostoevsky engages with these questions throughout the brothers Karamazov, and he does not offer a neat solution. Ivan's rebellion articulates the problem with devastating clarity, and Dostoevsky does not refute Ivan's arguments in a logical or philosophical sense. Instead, he offers a different kind of response, embodied in the lives and teachings of Zosima and Alyosha. This response does not deny suffering. It does not explain it away. It acknowledges suffering as a profound and ineradicable reality, but it insists that suffering can be transformed through love, through solidarity, through the willingness to bear one another's burdens. Zosima teaches that we are all responsible for all, and this means that we are all implicated in the suffering of the world. We cannot simply stand outside and judge God for permitting it. We are part of it, and we have a choice. We can respond to suffering with resentment and despair, as Ivan does, or we can respond with compassion and active love, as Zosima and Alyosha do. This is not a theodicy in the traditional sense. It is not a justification of God. It is an invitation to participate in the redemption of the world, to take up one's own cross, to accept suffering as an occasion for love rather than a reason for revolt. Dostoevsky also suggests that suffering has a kind of purifying power, that it can strip away illusions and open us to grace. This is a dangerous idea, and it can easily be misused to justify cruelty or to romanticize pain. Dostoevsky is aware of this danger. He does not advocate for suffering as a good in itself. He knows that suffering can destroy as well as purify. But he also knows that many people have experienced suffering as transformative, that it has led them to a deeper understanding of themselves and of life. This is the pattern in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov's suffering leads to his redemption. It is also the pattern in The Brothers Karamazov, where Dmitri, though innocent of the actual murder, accepts his suffering as a form of atonement for his other sins and as a way of becoming a better person. Suffering, in this view, is not willed by God as a good, but it can become a good if it is freely accepted and transformed through love. This is a mystical, even paradoxical insight, and it resists easy formulation. But it is central to Dostoevsky's Christian vision. He believes that the incarnation and crucifixion of Christ reveal the meaning of suffering. God does not stand outside suffering and observe it. God enters into suffering, bears it, and transforms it from within. And human beings are called to participate in this work of transformation. The question of theodicy is thus not primarily intellectual for Dostoevsky. It is existential and moral. It is not a puzzle to be solved, but a reality to be lived. Ivan's mistake is to treat it as an intellectual problem, to demand a rational explanation, and to reject the world when no explanation satisfies him. But Zosima and Alyosha understand that life is not a problem to be solved. It is a mystery to be entered into, a gift to be received, a task to be undertaken. Faith in this context is not the acceptance of a set of propositions. It is a fundamental orientation toward existence, a decision to affirm life despite its suffering, to trust in the goodness of creation despite all evidence to the contrary, and to act on the conviction that love is stronger than death. This is not easy. It is not a comfortable or comforting doctrine. It demands everything. But Dostoevsky believes that it is the only response that honors both the reality of suffering and the possibility of redemption. Any attempt to evade suffering, to explain it away, or to build a system that eliminates it will end in tyranny and dehumanization. But to face suffering honestly, to bear it patiently, and to transform it through love, this is the path of redemption, the way of the cross, the only hope for a fallen world. The murder of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov is the central event of The Brothers Karamazov, and the question of who is responsible for it drives much of the novel's plot. On the surface, the answer seems clear. Smerdyakov is the actual murderer. He strikes Fyodor with a paperweight, steals his money, and stages the scene to implicate Dmitri. But the novel complicates this simple answer in profound ways. Dmitri had publicly threatened to kill his father. He was in the vicinity on the night of the murder. He had motive, means, and opportunity. And although he did not commit the act, he is guilty in intention. He hated his father, wished him dead, and might well have killed him if circumstances had been different. Does this make him guilty? Smerdyakov argues that Ivan is responsible. Ivan's philosophy, his assertion that if there is no God everything is permitted, gave Smerdyakov the rationale and the encouragement to commit the crime. Ivan may not have explicitly ordered the murder, but he created the intellectual and moral climate in which it became thinkable. Does this make him guilty? And what about Fyodor himself? His depravity, his cruelty, his abuse of his sons created the conditions in which murder became almost inevitable. He destroyed his children's capacity to love and trust. He poisoned the atmosphere of the family. Does this make him complicit in his own death? Dostoevsky does not resolve these questions with a simple verdict. Instead, he uses them to explore the nature of guilt and responsibility. He suggests that responsibility is not a simple matter of causation. It is not enough to ask who physically committed the act. We must also ask who created the conditions, who failed to prevent it, who looked away, who remained silent. In this sense, everyone in the Karamazov family bears some degree of responsibility for the murder. And the novel extends this insight further. We are all responsible for all. This is Zosima's teaching, and it is enacted in the structure of the plot. Every character is implicated in the crime in some way, and every character must face the consequences. Dmitri is convicted and sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, even though he did not kill his father. He accepts this fate, not because he believes in the justice of the legal system, but because he recognizes that he is guilty in a deeper sense. He is guilty of hatred, of violence, of failure to love. And he sees his punishment as an opportunity for atonement, for transformation, for becoming a new man. Ivan collapses under the weight of his guilt. He confesses to the court that he is responsible, but his confession is not believed. He is dismissed as insane. But the reader knows that he is telling the truth. He is responsible, not in a legal sense, but in a moral and existential sense. His ideas, his cynicism, his refusal to affirm life, all of this contributed to the murder, and he cannot escape the knowledge of his complicity. Smerdyakov is the most tragic figure in this web of responsibility. He is Fyodor's illegitimate son, born of a woman with intellectual disabilities whom Fyodor raped. He has been raised as a servant, despised and humiliated by his father and brothers. He is intelligent but twisted, resentful and nihilistic. He takes Ivan's philosophy seriously and acts on it. He murders Fyodor, steals the money, and frames Dmitri. And then, when Ivan finally acknowledges his own guilt, Smerdyakov hangs himself. His suicide is not an act of despair over the crime itself. It is a response to Ivan's abandonment. Smerdyakov had expected Ivan to protect him, to share the responsibility, to affirm the logic of their shared nihilism. But Ivan, in his breakdown, repudiates all of this. He calls Smerdyakov a murderer, a monster, and Smerdyakov, left alone with his guilt and his emptiness, chooses death. His suicide note is bitter and accusatory. He blames Ivan, and he is right to blame Ivan, but he is also responsible himself. The novel does not allow anyone to escape guilt by shifting blame to another. Everyone is guilty, and everyone must face that guilt. This is the harsh truth at the center of the brothers Karamazov. But it is also a liberating truth, because it means that everyone has the capacity to change, to repent, to begin again. Dmitri's acceptance of his punishment is the beginning of his redemption. Ivan's breakdown is the first step toward his recovery, though the novel does not take us that far. And even Smerdyakov, in his suicide, acknowledges the reality of guilt, the fact that what he did matters, that it cannot simply be dismissed or rationalized away. The web of responsibility extends beyond the Karamazov family to society as a whole. The novel suggests that the murder is not simply the result of individual choices, but of a social and moral order that is broken. Fyodor is a product of a society that tolerates and even encourages debauchery and exploitation. Smerdyakov is a victim of that society, born into shame and servitude. Ivan's nihilism is a response to the hypocrisy and injustice he sees around him, and Dmitri's violence is the violence of a culture that glorifies passion and despises reason. The novel does not offer a political program or a blueprint for social reform, but it does insist that we cannot understand individual guilt without understanding the social context in which individuals act, and it calls on us to recognize our own complicity, our own responsibility for the evils we see. This is a radical ethical vision. It refuses the comforts of individualism, the belief that we are responsible only for our own actions and can remain innocent as long as we do not directly harm others. It insists that we are all bound together, that the suffering of one is the suffering of all, and that redemption requires a collective transformation, a change of heart that begins with each person but extends to the whole community. One of Dostoevsky's most profound psychological insights is his recognition that the self is not unified or transparent. We are not single, coherent subjects who know ourselves fully and act on that knowledge. We are divided, contradictory, opaque to ourselves. Dostoevsky's characters are constantly surprising themselves. They say things they did not intend to say, do things they did not intend to do, feel emotions they cannot explain or control. This is not a failure of characterization. It is an accurate representation of the complexity of consciousness. The underground man is the first and most explicit example of this divided self. He describes himself as contradictory, as simultaneously proud and self-loathing, aggressive and cowardly, defiant and ashamed. He says one thing and means another. He performs for an imaginary audience even when he is alone. He is never simply himself because there is no simple self to be. He is a site of conflict, a battleground of competing voices and impulses. This phenomenon, which Dostoevsky explored throughout his career, anticipates what modern psychology would call the unconscious. Freud acknowledged his debt to Dostoevsky, calling him the greatest psychologist who ever lived. But Dostoevsky's psychology is not identical to Freud's. For Freud, the unconscious is a repository of repressed desires and traumatic memories. For Dostoevsky, the divided self is not primarily about repression. It is about freedom, about the fact that we are not determined by our past or our nature, that we are always in the process of becoming, that we can surprise ourselves and others by acting in ways that violate all expectation. This is what makes confession so central to Dostoevsky's novels. Confession is the attempt to make the divided self whole, to bring the hidden parts of the self into the light, to acknowledge what one has done and who one is. But confession is difficult and dangerous. It exposes one to judgment, to shame, to the possibility of rejection. And so people avoid it. They lie, they rationalize, they hide. They construct elaborate narratives to justify themselves, to present a coherent and acceptable self to the world. But these narratives are fragile. They crack under pressure. And when they crack, the person is confronted with the reality of their own dividedness, their own lack of self-knowledge, their own capacity for self-deception. Dostoevsky also explores what we might call double consciousness, a state in which a person is simultaneously aware of two contradictory truths. Raskolnikov knows that he has committed murder, but he also tries to convince himself that he has done nothing wrong. Ivan knows that he is complicit in his father's murder, but he also tries to deny that knowledge. Stavrogin knows that he is empty and dead inside, but he also tries to perform the role of a living person. This double consciousness is a form of bad faith in the existentialist sense. It is the attempt to escape responsibility by pretending not to know what one knows. But Dostoevsky shows that this attempt always fails. The truth cannot be permanently suppressed. It returns in the form of guilt, anxiety, hallucination, breakdown. The divided self cannot remain divided indefinitely. It must either be reunited through confession and repentance, or it will be destroyed by the tension of its own contradictions. This is the drama that plays out in all of Dostoevsky's major novels. The protagonist is torn between two parts of the self, the part that knows the truth and the part that denies it. And the resolution comes only when the protagonist accepts the truth, faces the guilt, and takes responsibility. The divided self is also a moral phenomenon. It is not simply a psychological fact, but a consequence of our freedom. Because we are free, we are capable of acting against our own principles, of betraying our own values, of becoming someone we did not intend to be. And this capacity is both exhilarating and terrifying. It means that we are never finished, never complete, never safe from the possibility of radical change. Dostoevsky's characters are always on the edge of transformation. They are capable of sudden conversions, sudden falls, sudden acts of grace or cruelty. This is what makes them so alive, so unpredictable, so unsettling. They are not types or symbols. They are persons in the full sense, free, self-determining, irreducible, and this freedom is inseparable from their dividedness. To be free is to be divided, to be pulled in multiple directions, to be uncertain of who one is or what one will become. The task of life, Dostoevsky suggests, is not to eliminate this division, but to integrate it, to accept one's contradictions and live with them honestly, to take responsibility for all the parts of oneself, even the parts one would prefer to disown. This is the work of confession, the work of self-knowledge, the work of becoming fully human. Shame is one of the most powerful emotions in Dostoevsky's novels, and it is intimately connected to the structure of the divided self. Shame is the feeling of being exposed, of being seen as one does not wish to be seen. It is the pain of recognition, the moment when one's self-image is shattered by the gaze of the other. Dostoevsky's characters are haunted by shame. They are acutely aware of how they appear to others, and they construct elaborate defenses to protect themselves from exposure. But these defenses are always failing. In scenes of scandal, the masks come off, and the person is revealed in all their ugliness, weakness, or absurdity. These scenes are painful to read, but they are also moments of truth. They strip away the pretense and force the person to confront who they really are. The underground man is consumed by shame. He is ashamed of his poverty, his appearance, his social status, his inability to act. And this shame drives him to perform for others, to assert his superiority, to humiliate those who are weaker than he is. But his performances only deepen his shame. The more he tries to prove his worth, the more ridiculous he becomes. And he knows this. He is simultaneously the actor and the audience, the humiliated and the humiliator. Pride is the flip side of shame. Where shame is the pain of being seen as inferior, pride is the pleasure of being seen as superior. But in Dostoevsky's novels, pride is always fragile. It depends on the recognition of others, and that recognition can be withdrawn at any moment. Raskolnikov's pride in being an extraordinary individual collapses when he cannot bear the guilt of murder. Ivan's intellectual pride collapses when he confronts the consequences of his philosophy. Stavrogin's aristocratic pride collapses into emptiness and suicide. Pride, for Dostoevsky, is a form of self-deception. It is the attempt to secure one's identity through the opinion of others, to become a fixed and stable self that cannot be challenged or doubted. But this attempt is doomed to fail because personhood is not fixed or stable. It is dynamic, relational, always in process. And the attempt to make it fixed results in a kind of death, a hardening of the self that cuts it off from growth, from change, from love. Confession is the antidote to pride. It is the willingness to be seen as one truly is, without pretense or defense. It is the surrender of the attempt to control one's image, the acceptance of vulnerability, the admission that one is not self-sufficient but dependent on the mercy and recognition of others. Dostoevsky's novels are full of what might be called the theatre of confession. Characters confess publicly, in front of audiences, in ways that are dramatic and often theatrical. Raskolnikov confesses in a crowded police station. Dmitri confesses in court. Stavrogin publishes a written confession. The underground man confesses to an imaginary audience in the form of his notes. These public confessions are not simply legal or social acts. They are existential performances, acts of self-revelation and self-constitution. By confessing, the person steps out of concealment and into visibility. He makes himself an object of judgment, but also a subject of recognition. He says, This is who I am. See me, judge me, but also acknowledge me, accept me. The confession is a plea for love, for forgiveness, for the restoration of relationality. But it is also a risk. The person who confesses exposes himself to the possibility of rejection, of condemnation, of being turned away. And this is why confession is so difficult. It requires courage, humility, and faith that love is possible even for the guilty, even for the broken, even for the unworthy. The relationship between shame and confession is paradoxical. On one hand, shame drives people to hide, to conceal their faults, to protect themselves from exposure. On the other hand, shame can also drive people to confess, to seek punishment, to bring their guilt into the open. This is the pattern in crime and punishment. Raskolnikov's shame over his crime makes him want to hide, but it also makes him want to be caught, to be punished, to have his guilt acknowledged. He oscillates between these two impulses, and his confession is the moment when the second impulse wins out. But the confession does not eliminate the shame, it intensifies it. To confess is to make oneself vulnerable, to stand naked before the other, to accept one's guilt and one's need for mercy. And this is precisely what makes confession redemptive. It is not the elimination of shame, but the transformation of shame, the conversion of shame from a force that isolates and paralyzes into a force that connects and liberates. By confessing, one acknowledges one's place in the human community, one's solidarity with all who have sinned and suffered. One steps back into relation, and in that return, redemption becomes possible. At the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy is a commitment to the irreducibility of the person. A person is not a thing, not an object that can be fully known or controlled, not a function in a system, not a means to an end. A person is a subject, a center of consciousness and will, an origin of meaning and value, and this subjectivity is constituted by freedom. To be a person is to be free, not in the sense of having unlimited power or the absence of constraint, but in the sense of being self-determining, capable of choice, responsible for one's actions. Freedom, for Dostoevsky, is not simply a political or legal category. It is an ontological fact, a fundamental feature of what it means to be human. And any attempt to deny or suppress this freedom is an attack on humanity itself. This is why Dostoevsky is so opposed to the determinist ideologies of his time, whether they are materialist, utilitarian, or socialist. These ideologies all assume that human behavior can be explained and predicted by laws, that people are products of their environment and their biology, and that the task of social reform is to manipulate those factors to produce better outcomes. Dostoevsky does not deny that environment and biology matter, but he insists that they do not determine us, that we are always capable of surprising ourselves and others, of acting in ways that violate all expectation and all calculation. This commitment to freedom has profound ethical implications. If persons are irreducible subjects rather than objects, then they must be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. This is the Kantian principle, and Dostoevsky shares it, though he arrives at it through a different route. Kant grounds the principle in the rational nature of human beings, in their capacity for moral law. Dostoevsky grounds it in the infinite value of the person, in the fact that every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore possesses a dignity that cannot be measured or traded. This is why Raskolnikov's crime is so monstrous. He has treated the pawnbroker as a means to his own ends, as an obstacle to be removed, as less than a person. And in doing so, he has violated not only her, but also himself. He has betrayed his own humanity, his own capacity for recognition and love. The ethical task for Dostoevsky is to see and treat others as persons, to recognize their subjectivity, their freedom, their irreducibility. And this is not easy. It requires attention, empathy, the willingness to be interrupted and challenged by the other. It requires giving up the attempt to control or possess or understand the other completely. It requires respecting the mystery of the other, the fact that the other is always more than I can know or say. Dostoevsky's ethics is thus deeply relational. Personhood is not something that exists in isolation. It is constituted through relation, through the encounter with the other. I become a person by being recognized as a person by another. And I recognize the other as a person by responding to them, by addressing them, by acknowledging their claim on me. This is what Bakhtin means by dialogism. The self is not a monologue, but a dialogue, a conversation with others that never reaches a final conclusion, and this dialogue is ethical in its very structure. To enter into genuine dialogue is to respect the otherness of the other, to allow them to speak, to listen to what they say, to be affected and changed by it. Dostoevsky's novels enact this dialogical ethics. They do not tell us what to think. They present us with multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and they invite us to engage with them, to wrestle with them, to allow them to challenge our own assumptions and convictions. This is why reading Dostoevsky is such an intense and unsettling experience. We are not spectators. We are participants. We are drawn into the dialogue, and we cannot remain neutral or detached. The irreducibility of the person also means that moral responsibility cannot be evaded or transferred. I cannot blame my environment, my biology, my upbringing, or my social position for what I do. These factors may influence me, but they do not determine me. I am free, and therefore I am responsible. This is a hard teaching, and Dostoevsky does not soften it. He knows that people want to escape responsibility, that we construct elaborate narratives to justify ourselves, to explain away our failures and our sins. But he insists that these narratives are lies, that they betray the dignity of personhood, that they reduce us to things. To accept responsibility is to affirm one's freedom, to acknowledge that one is the author of one's actions, and to accept the consequences. This is what Raskolnikov learns, what Dmitri learns, what every protagonist in Dostoevsky's novels must learn. And it is a painful lesson. It means facing one's guilt, accepting one's punishment, living with the knowledge of what one has done. But it is also a liberating lesson, because if I am responsible, then I am also capable of change. If I am free, then I am not determined by my past. I can repent, I can begin again, I can become someone new. This is the hope at the center of Dostoevsky's ethics, that redemption is always possible, that no one is beyond the reach of grace, that freedom and responsibility are the grounds of transformation. Dostoevsky's Christianity is not conventional or comfortable. It is not the Christianity of the Grand Inquisitor, who offers miracle, mystery, and authority as substitutes for freedom. It is not the Christianity of social respectability, of moral platitudes, of easy answers. It is the Christianity of the cross, of suffering, of doubt, of risk. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is not the acceptance of dogma or the performance of rituals. It is a fundamental orientation toward existence, a decision to affirm life and love despite all evidence to the contrary. It is a commitment made in the face of uncertainty, a leap into the unknown, a trust that does not depend on proof or guarantee. This is why Dostoevsky's novels are full of doubt. Ivan's rebellion, Kirillov's atheism, Stavrogin's emptiness, all of these are expressions of honest doubt, of the struggle to believe in a world that seems to offer no grounds for belief. And Dostoevsky takes these doubts seriously. He does not dismiss them or refute them with easy arguments. He allows them to stand in all their force because he understands that faith that has not wrestled with doubt is not genuine faith. It is credulity, wishful thinking, self-deception. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is inseparable from freedom. God does not compel belief. He offers himself, and he leaves us free to accept or reject him. This is the meaning of Christ's silence in response to the Grand Inquisitor. He will not argue, will not prove himself, will not perform miracles to coerce belief. He offers only love, and love requires freedom. It cannot be forced or manipulated. It must be freely given and freely received. This is why the Grand Inquisitor's vision is so perverse. He wants to remove the burden of freedom, to give people certainty and security in exchange for their obedience. But in doing so, he destroys the possibility of genuine faith, genuine love, genuine personhood. He creates a world of slaves, not persons, of obedience, not love. And this is the great temptation of religion, the temptation to replace faith with certainty, love with law, freedom with control. Dostoevsky resists this temptation with all his strength. He insists that Christianity is not about certainty, but about risk, not about answers, but about questions, not about possession, but about gift. To have faith is to live in a state of openness, of vulnerability, of dependence on grace. It is to accept that one does not know, that one cannot prove, that one must trust in the face of doubt. Dostoevsky also insists that faith is not primarily about belief in abstract doctrines. It is about relationship, about love, about action. Zosima's teaching of active love is central here. Faith is not a matter of assenting to propositions about God. It is a matter of living in a certain way, of serving others, of practicing compassion, of accepting responsibility. Faith is enacted, not argued. It is a practice, a discipline, a way of being in the world. And this practice does not depend on having clear and certain knowledge of God. It depends on the decision to love, to affirm life, to say yes to existence. Alyosha's faith is of this kind. He does not have theological sophistication or philosophical arguments. He has a simple, direct trust in God and in the goodness of creation. And this trust is expressed in his actions, in his kindness, his patience, his willingness to serve. This is why Alyosha is the hero of the brothers Karamazov. He embodies the kind of faith that Dostoevsky believes is authentic, a faith that is not afraid of doubt, that does not cling to certainty, that is willing to risk everything on love. The relationship between faith and doubt is dialectical. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is a constitutive element of faith. To have faith is to believe despite doubt, to affirm in the face of negation, to say yes even when everything seems to say no. This is the paradox that Dostoevsky explores throughout his work. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the overcoming of doubt, the movement through doubt to a deeper, more resilient affirmation. And this movement is never final. It is a continuous process, a daily struggle, a constant renewal of commitment. Dostoevsky's own life reflects this struggle. He experienced profound doubts, periods of crisis and despair, moments when faith seemed impossible. But he kept returning to faith, kept choosing to believe, kept affirming the possibility of redemption. And his novels are records of this struggle, testimonies to the difficulty and the necessity of faith. They do not offer easy consolation. They offer something more valuable, the truth that faith is possible even in a world of suffering, that love is stronger than death, and that redemption is always available to those who are willing to accept it. The phrase "everyone is responsible for" all appears repeatedly in the brothers Karamazov, and it encapsulates one of Dostoevsky's most important ethical insights. The phrase is paradoxical. How can I be responsible for what others do? How can I be guilty of sins I did not commit? The answer lies in Dostoevsky's understanding of the relational nature of personhood. We are not isolated individuals. We are members of a community, participants in a shared life, implicated in a web of relations that binds us to all other persons. What any one of us does affects all the others. And what any one of us fails to do, the love we withhold, the help we refuse, the injustice we ignore, also affects all the others. We are responsible for all because we are all part of one another. This is not a mystical or metaphorical claim. It is a recognition of the deep interdependence of human life. My well-being depends on the well-being of others. My sins contribute to a moral atmosphere that makes it easier for others to sin. My virtues contribute to a moral atmosphere that makes it easier for others to be good. And I cannot separate myself from this web. I cannot say, I am innocent because I did not directly harm anyone. I am implicated simply by being part of the human community. This insight has radical implications. It means that I cannot simply judge others and declare myself righteous. I must recognize my own complicity in the evils of the world. I must acknowledge that I too am a sinner, that I too have failed to love, that I too bear responsibility. This is the meaning of Zosima's teaching that each of us is guilty before all for all. It is a call to humility, to self-examination, to the recognition that we are all in need of mercy. But it is also a call to action. If I am responsible for all, then I cannot remain passive in the face of suffering. I must do what I can to alleviate it, to serve others, to practice active love. This is not a burden in the negative sense. It is a recognition of the dignity and the calling of personhood. To be a person is to be responsible, to be capable of response, to be able to answer the call of the other. And this responsiveness is not optional. It is constitutive of who we are. To refuse responsibility is to refuse our own humanity, to treat ourselves and others as things rather than persons. Compassion for Dostoevsky is not sentimentality or pity. It is the capacity to suffer with another, to enter into their experience, to bear their burden. The word compassion literally means suffering together. And this is what Dostoevsky's novels ask of us. They ask us to enter into the suffering of the characters, to see the world through their eyes, to feel what they feel. They ask us to recognize that even the most degraded, the most guilty, the most hateful person is still a person, still worthy of recognition and love. This is an extraordinarily difficult demand. It is easy to have compassion for the innocent, for the victims, for those who suffer through no fault of their own. It is much harder to have compassion for the guilty, for the perpetrators, for those whose own choices have led to their suffering. But Dostoevsky insists that this is precisely what is required. Raskolnikov is a murderer, but he is also a suffering human being. Stavrogin is a monster, but he is also a lost soul. Even Fyodor Pavlovich, the dissolute and abusive father, is worthy of compassion. He too is a victim of his own appetites, his own emptiness, his own inability to love. To have compassion is to see the person beneath the sin, to recognize the humanity that persists, even in the most corrupted individual. And this recognition is the beginning of redemption, both for the other and for oneself. Solidarity is the social and political expression of this compassion. To stand in solidarity with others is to acknowledge one's common humanity, to refuse the divisions and hierarchies that separate us, to affirm that we are all in this together. Dostoevsky was deeply suspicious of the political movements of his time, which he saw as divisive and violent, but he was not opposed to solidarity itself. He believed that true solidarity is grounded in love, in the recognition of our mutual dependence and our shared responsibility. And he believed that this solidarity must be enacted at the level of personal relationships, through concrete acts of service and care, rather than through abstract political programs. Zosima's teaching of active love is a teaching of solidarity. It calls us to serve those who are near to us, to attend to their needs, to be present to their suffering, and it insists that this personal, concrete solidarity is more important and more effective than any grand scheme for social transformation. This is not to say that social and political action is unimportant, but it is to say that such action must be grounded in love and responsibility, not in ideology or the will to power. And it is to say that the transformation of society begins with the transformation of persons, with each of us accepting our own responsibility for all and acting on that responsibility in our daily lives. Dostoevsky is often called a precursor of existentialism, and rightly so. Many of the themes that would define existentialist philosophy in the 20th century are present in his novels. The primacy of freedom, the irreducibility of the person, the anxiety of choice, the confrontation with meaninglessness, the necessity of commitment, the reality of bad faith and self-deception. Existentialist thinkers like Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus all engaged with Dostoevsky's work and acknowledged his influence. Nietzsche read Dostoevsky in the last years of his life and called him the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. Sartre drew on notes from Underground in his analysis of bad faith. Camus engaged deeply with Dostoevsky's treatment of rebellion and nihilism. But Dostoevsky is not simply a precursor. He is a fully developed existentialist thinker in his own right, even though he wrote before existentialism as a philosophical movement existed. His novels explore existential themes with a depth and concreteness that philosophy often struggles to achieve. They show us what it means to live in a world without fixed certainties, to confront the abyss, to choose in the face of radical freedom, and they show us the consequences of different choices, the ways that our decisions shape who we become. Dostoevsky's psychology anticipates not only existentialism, but also psychoanalysis. Freud acknowledged his debt to Dostoevsky, and many of the phenomena that Freud would later theorize, repression, the unconscious, the divided self, the return of the repressed, the compulsion to confess, are vividly portrayed in Dostoevsky's novels. But Dostoevsky's psychology is not mechanistic or deterministic in the way that Freud's sometimes is. For Freud, the unconscious is a repository of drives and memories that exert a causal influence on behavior. For Dostoevsky, the divided self is not simply a matter of causation. It is a matter of meaning, of interpretation, of the struggle to integrate one's experience into a coherent narrative. Dostoevsky's characters are not determined by their pasts, even though they are shaped by them. They are always capable of reinterpreting their pasts, of choosing to respond to them in different ways, of becoming something new. This is what makes Dostoevsky's psychology existential rather than merely clinical. He is interested not only in how people become who they are, but in how they might become someone different, how they might achieve transformation and redemption. Dostoevsky also anticipates the existentialist emphasis on anxiety and despair. Anxiety, in existentialist thought, is not simply fear of a specific object. It is the dread that arises when we confront our own freedom, when we realize that we are responsible for our own lives and that there is no external authority to tell us what to do. Dostoevsky's characters experience this anxiety intensely. Raskolnikov is paralyzed by anxiety before and after the murder. Ivan is tormented by anxiety over his complicity in his father's death. Kirillov experiences a kind of metaphysical anxiety, a terror at the absurdity of existence. And despair, in existentialist thought, is the state of having lost faith in the possibility of meaning, of being unable to affirm life or commit to any project. Stavrogin embodies this despair. He has tried everything and found nothing worth caring about. He is beyond hope and beyond help. His despair is not a mood that will pass. It is a fundamental condition, a spiritual death. And Dostoevsky shows that despair is not simply a psychological problem. It is a moral and spiritual problem. It is the refusal of hope, the denial that redemption is possible, the choice to remain in darkness rather than to seek the light. But Dostoevsky is not only a diagnostician of despair, he is also a witness to the possibility of hope. His novels show that even the most lost, the most guilty, the most despairing can be redeemed if they are willing to accept responsibility, to confess, to love. This is the existentialist demand for authenticity, for living honestly and courageously in the face of one's own freedom and one's own mortality. And it is also a demand for commitment, for choosing to affirm life and love despite all reasons to despair. Dostoevsky's existentialism is thus not nihilistic. It does not end in despair or absurdity. It points toward redemption, toward the possibility of becoming fully human, toward the hope that love is stronger than death. This is what distinguishes Dostoevsky from many later existentialist thinkers. He shares their diagnosis of the human condition: freedom, anxiety, the absence of fixed certainties, but he does not share their pessimism. He believes that redemption is possible, that grace is real, that love can transform even the most broken life. And this belief gives his existentialism a dimension of hope that is often lacking in the existentialism of Sartre or Camus. Dostoevsky's influence on 20th century literature and philosophy is difficult to overstate. His novels reshaped the possibilities of fiction, demonstrating that narrative could grapple with philosophical and theological questions in ways that matched or exceeded the rigor of formal philosophy. His psychological insights influenced the development of depth psychology, existential psychology, and psychoanalysis. His political prophecies about the dangers of ideological fanaticism were vindicated by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And his ethical and spiritual vision continues to challenge and inspire readers around the world. Among novelists, Dostoevsky's influence can be seen in writers as diverse as Franz Kafka, André Gide, William Faulkner, Ralph Ellison, Flannery O'Connor, and J.M. Coetzee. These writers share Dostoevsky's interest in extreme psychological states, moral ambiguity, and the collision between individual consciousness and social or metaphysical forces. Kafka's The Trial and the Castle evoke the same atmosphere of inexplicable guilt and absurdity that pervades Dostoevsky's work. Faulkner's exploration of the divided South, with its legacy of violence and injustice, echoes Dostoevsky's exploration of divided Russia. O'Connor's stories of grace and grotesquerie, of violence and redemption, are deeply Dostoevskian in spirit. Among philosophers, Dostoevsky's influence is most evident in existentialism and phenomenology. Kierkegaard, though he preceded Dostoevsky, shares many of his concerns: the primacy of the individual, the anxiety of freedom, the leap of faith. Nietzsche read Dostoevsky late in his life and recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood the psychology of resentment, the will to power, and the death of God. Heidegger's analysis of being and anxiety in Being and Time has affinities with Dostoevsky's portrayal of dread and self-estrangement. Sartre's concept of bad faith, the attempt to escape one's freedom by pretending to be determined, is illustrated vividly in Dostoevsky's characters. Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus and the Rebel engage directly with Dostoevsky's treatment of absurdity, rebellion, and the limits of revolt. Camus praises Dostoevsky for his honesty in confronting the problem of suffering, but criticizes him for ultimately choosing faith over revolt. And Levinas's ethics of the other, with its emphasis on the face-to-face encounter and the infinite responsibility to the other, can be read as a philosophical articulation of themes that Dostoevsky explored novelistically. Dostoevsky also influenced theological and religious thought. Christian existentialist thinkers like Paul Tillich, Nicholas Berdyaev, and Karl Barth drew on Dostoevsky's work to articulate a Christianity that took seriously the realities of doubt, suffering, and human freedom. Smerdyakov, a Russian émigré, wrote extensively on Dostoevsky and argued that his novels contained a profound theological anthropology, a vision of the human person as created in the image of God and called to freedom and responsibility. Tillich incorporated Dostoevsky's insights into his own theology of correlation, which sought to address the existential anxieties of modern life. And Barth, though more cautious about Dostoevsky's theology, recognized the power of his critique of religion and his insistence on the radical freedom of God and the freedom of the human person before God. Even secular thinkers have found in Dostoevsky a resource for thinking about ethics, politics, and the meaning of human existence. Isaiah Berlin, for example, used Dostoevsky's notes from Underground as a starting point for his critique of utilitarianism and his defense of pluralism and negative liberty. Dostoevsky's political prophecy has proven disturbingly accurate. Demons anticipated the dynamics of totalitarian movements with uncanny precision. The manipulation of idealistic rhetoric to justify violence. The creation of cell structures bound by shared guilt. The subordination of individual conscience to ideological purity. The cult of the leader. The willingness to sacrifice the present for an imagined future. Readers in the 20th century, living through the Russian Revolution, Stalinism, Nazism, and other totalitarian regimes, recognized that Dostoevsky had seen what was coming. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself a witness to the Soviet Gulag, praised Dostoevsky for his insight into the nihilistic and revolutionary mentality. And political theorists like Hannah Arendt, though she did not cite Dostoevsky directly, articulated analyses of totalitarianism that echoed his warnings. Dostoevsky understood that the greatest danger to freedom comes not from traditional tyranny, but from ideological movements that claim to liberate humanity while actually enslaving it, that promise paradise while delivering hell, that reduce persons to instruments of a grand historical design. And he understood that this danger arises not from evil intentions, but from the refusal to recognize limits, the denial of moral complexity, and the attempt to impose absolute solutions on the irreducible particularity of human life. Life is not a problem to be solved. This is perhaps the most succinct summary of Dostoevsky's vision. The phrase comes from the title assigned to this episode, and it captures the fundamental orientation of his work. The modern age, Dostoevsky believed, had made a catastrophic error. It had treated human life as a problem amenable to rational solution. It had assumed that if we could just identify the right principles, the right system, the right social arrangement, we could eliminate suffering, maximize happiness, and create a harmonious society. This assumption underlies utilitarianism, socialism, scientific materialism, and many other progressive ideologies of the 19th century. And it is an assumption that Dostoevsky rejects utterly. Life is not a problem. It is a mystery. It is a question that cannot be answered by calculation or theory. It is a reality to be lived, encountered, suffered, and transformed through love. Any attempt to reduce it to a formula, to fit it into a system, to solve it once and for all, will result in violence and the destruction of what is most human about us. This does not mean that Dostoevsky is opposed to reason or progress. He is not advocating for irrationalism or obscurantism. He is arguing that reason has limits, that there are dimensions of human existence that exceed rational comprehension, and that the attempt to impose rational order on everything leads to tyranny. Reason is a tool, a valuable and necessary tool, but it is not the only tool, and it is not adequate to the full complexity of human life. We need reason, but we also need faith, imagination, compassion, and the willingness to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. We need to recognize that we do not possess the truth, but are always seeking it, that we are not finished, but always becoming, that we are not isolated individuals but members of a community bound together by love and responsibility. This is the vision that animates Dostoevsky's novels. They do not offer solutions, they offer encounters. They invite us to enter into the lives of their characters, to struggle with the questions they struggle with, to feel the weight of their choices, to recognize our own capacity for good and evil. And they leave us changed, unsettled, challenged. They do not tell us what to think. They teach us how to think, how to attend to complexity, how to resist the seduction of simple answers, how to live honestly and courageously in the face of doubt and suffering. The great themes of Dostoevsky's work, freedom and responsibility, suffering and redemption, faith and doubt, love and isolation, pride and humility, guilt and confession, are not historical curiosities. They are perennial questions, questions that every generation must confront anew. We live in a world that is in many ways very different from Dostoevsky's. We have technologies, opportunities, and freedoms that he could not have imagined. But we also face many of the same temptations and dangers. We are still tempted to reduce persons to functions, to treat human life as material for social engineering, to sacrifice the present for the future, to seek security at the cost of freedom. We are still divided against ourselves, still haunted by guilt and shame, still struggling to integrate our contradictions, still seeking meaning in a world that often seems meaningless. And we still need what Dostoevsky offers, a vision of the human person as irreducibly free and irreducibly valuable, a vision of ethics grounded in love and responsibility, a vision of redemption as possible even for the most lost and broken among us. This is not a comfortable vision. It is demanding. It calls us to examine ourselves honestly, to accept our guilt, to love without calculation, to live without certainty. But it is also a hopeful vision. It insists that we are not determined by our past, that we are capable of change, that love is stronger than death, and that every person, no matter how degraded, retains the capacity for transformation. As we come to the end of this long meditation on Dostoevsky, we are reminded that his novels are not simply objects of study or sources of ideas. They are living works, texts that continue to challenge and disturb us, that refuse to be domesticated or explained away. They resist closure. They leave questions unanswered. They present us with characters who are contradictory, unfinished, alive, and they demand from us a response, a decision, a commitment. We cannot read Dostoevsky passively. We must engage, must wrestle, must allow his questions to become our questions, and in doing so, we participate in the ongoing dialogue that is the life of literature and philosophy, the search for truth and meaning that defines our humanity. Dostoevsky's work is a gift, a testament to the power of art to illuminate the depths of human existence, to reveal what is hidden, to make visible the invisible struggles of the soul. And it is a call to live more honestly, more courageously, more lovingly, to accept our freedom and our responsibility, and to trust that even in a world of suffering, redemption is possible,